From Merrick's Inquiry into Antient Armour. Pikeman. From Gros's Military Antiquities. Musters of the citizens were frequent in the reign of Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth XII. A history of the muster of the citizens on the 8th of May 1539, the 31st of Henry VIII, is given at length in the records of the Corporation, Journal 14, folio 166. They marched from Mile End to Whitehall, and from thence to Leadenhall. Sir W.M. Foreman, K.N.T. Lord Mayor was in bright harness, whereof the cuirass, the mancers, gauntelets, and other parts were gilt upon the crests and borders, and with that he had a coat of black velvet with a rich cross embroidered, and a great massy chain of gold about his neck, and on his head a cap of black velvet with a rich jewel. He had a goodly jennet richly trapped, with embroidery of gold set upon crimson velvet. About him attended 4 footmen, all apparelled in white satin hose and all puffed over with white sarcenet. In 1559, July 2 and 3, according to Stow's Chronicle edit. 1615, p. 639, the citizens mustered before Queen Elizabeth in Greenwich Park, 1,400 men being present, 800 pikemen in fine corselets, 400 harquebuts in shirts of mail with moorings, and 200 halberders in almond rivets. A large number of the citizens were also present. The price of armour at this date, as given in several records, was for a corselet 30s, harquebus complete 8s, a merion 6s 8d, almain rivet 10s, a musket, flask, touchbox and tassels 17s, 6d, gunpowder 12d per pound. Here, for instance, Archchallenger Vol. Roman 32, p. 32, is an account of a muster before Henry VIII. Then the said Lord Mayor and his brethren assembled themselves again, and after lunge consultaken, they fierce determined that no alien, although he were a denizen, should muster, but only mere Englishmen. Further, they thought it not convenient that all the whole number of Englishmen should muster, and go out of the city for a special considerations, nor that such as had jacks, brigandines, or coats of fence, should go in the muster, but only they appointed 321 sich which were hable peas ones, and had white harns with white coats, bows, arrows, halberds, bills or palaxes, and none other except such as bare morays pikes or handguns, which only had plents and skulls, with white coats and white caps with feathers, and all thys company was commanded to be in white hose and cleanly shod, when it was known that the king himself would see the muster, to see how gladly every man prepared him, what desire every man had to do his prince service. It was a joyful sit to behold of every Englishman. Then every man of substance provided himself a coat of silk, and garnished their bassinets with turbs of silk set with broaches, ouches and feathers. Some had their harns and palaxes jilted, some had their breastplates carved with silver bullion. Every man devised to do his best to of his prince, and of thy sort the most part had chains of gold. The meaner sort were in coats of white cotton, cleanly hosed and shod with the arms of the city before and behind. The constables were all in jowets of white silk over their harns, with battle axes gilt, and chains about their necks. The said Lord Mayor, aldermen, recorder, shrives, and such as had benny shrives, were in white harns, and over that coats of black velvet, with the arms of the city richly peeled and embroidered upon the same, with great chains of gold about their necks, mounted on good horses well stiring and richly trapped, with battle axes in their hands, and caps of velvet in their heads. And every alderman had halberdars in white silk or buff coats attending on thedge, with gilt halberds, and the mayor had XVJ, apparelled as you shall hear hereafter. All these were 322 captains of the battles, as you shall save in their setting forward. The chamberlain and councillors of the city, and the aldermen's deputies which were assigned to be whifflers on horsebacky, were all in coats of white damask over their harns, mounted on good horses, well trapped, with great chains about their necks, and proper javelins or battle axes in their hands, with caps of velvet on their heads with rich ouches. The whifflers on foot were proper lit peas ones appelled in white silk or buff jerkins, without harns or white hose and white shoes, every man having a slaw sword or a javelin to keep the people in array, with chains about their necks and feathers in their caps. The minstrels also were all in white, and so were the standard bearers, which were the tallest men in every ward, all appelled in silk, for whom were made XXX new standards with the devises of the city, to see how full of lords, ladies, and gentlewomen the windows in every street were, and how the streets of the city were replenished with people. Many men wold have thought that they that mustered had rather bind strangers than citizens, considering that the streets everywhere were so full of people, which was to strangers a great merveille, to report what good order the citizens kept in passing forward, what pain the whifflers both on horseback and foot took in keeping the soldiers in array, how rich the jewels, chains, and appel were, how many goodly, tall, and comely men were there, and the number of the same, my wit-wise insufficient to exps or my pen to write. Wherefore I remit these points to thame that saw and numberet them, and desiring them to remember the number that passed in the muster, and not to forget in Thayer accompt thame that tarried at home or stowed in the streets, for the one without the other showeth not the whole puissance of the city. But whatsoever was doon, and what pain soever was taken, all was to the citizens a great gladness. Musketeer. From Grose's Military Antiquities. It will thus be seen that military array had arrived at a new and quite another kind of splendour. Armour had not gone out, but it was less cumbrous, and people believed less in its value. It availed to a certain extent against sword and pike, but not at all against bullet. The pikemen who carried pikes 18 or 20 feet in length wore a breastplate. The billmen had lighter armour. Their weapon was a hook or a staff. Both pikemen and billmen were employed in covering field guns against cavalry. Watchmen also carried bills. The firearms were the harquebus or arquebus, the small petronel, the culverin, the long petronel, and the musket. The larger kinds were fired with the barrel resting on a fork stuck in the ground. Swords and daggers were, of course, carried, and gentlemen wore expensive chain and plate armour. Henry VIII had a wonderful suit of armour made in Germany. It was engraved with illustrations from the lives of martyrs and saints, some of which are reproduced on p. 382, from the illustrations given in Archaeology. Chapter 5. The Prentices. This chapter is inserted in the Tudor period, because the prentice in that century arrived at the height of his power and importance, chiefly as a disturber of the peace. The following pages sum up the regulations on the subject from the 15th to the 18th century, both inclusive. The importance of the apprentice system caused many ordinances and regulations to be passed from time to time. Thus, in 1406 no persons were allowed to put out their children as apprentices who had not land to the value of 20 shillings a year, a regulation intended, in a populous town, to keep up the status of trades and crafts. The act was, however, found impossible to work, and was repealed in 1429, to the great satisfaction of the citizens. Later on, in 1486, another attempt was made to restrict the freedom of the city, and to keep out mean and improper persons by an ordinance that no apprentice should be taken nor freedom given except to such as were gentlemen born. This is Maitland's statement, agreeable to the clause in the oath given to every freeman at the time he was made free in these words: Ye shall take none apprentice but if he be freeborn, that is to say, no bondman's son, nor the son of any alien. It does not appear, however, from the oath, that the freeman was required to be a gentleman unless every freeborn person is a gentleman. How could a blacksmith or a journeyman saddler be a gentleman? In 1527, the Common Council passed a stringent rule as to the treatment of apprentices. If hereafter any freeman or freewoman of this city take any apprentice, and within the term of 7 years suffer the same apprentice to go at his large liberty and pleasure, and within or after the said term agree with his said apprentice for a certain sum of money, or otherwise, for his said service, and within or after the end of the said term, the said freeman present the said apprentice to the chamberlain of the city, and by good deliberation, and upon his oath made to the same city, the same freeman or freewoman assureth and affirmeth to the said chamberlain, that the said apprentice hath fully served his 3/24 said term as apprentice. Or if any freeman or freewoman of this city take any apprentice which at the time of the said taking hath any wife, or if any freeman or freewoman of this city give any wages to his or her apprentice, or suffer the said apprentices to take any part of their own getting of gains, or if any freeman or freewoman of this city hereafter colour any foreign goods, or from henceforth buy or sell for any person or persons, or with or to any person or persons, being foreign or foreigners, cloths, silks, wine, oils, or any other goods or merchandise, whatsoever they be, whether he take anything or things for his or their wages or labour, or not, or if any person or persons being free of this city by any colour or deceitful means, from henceforth do buy, sell, or receive of any apprentice within this city any money, goods, merchandise, or wares, without the assent or licence of his master or mistress, and upon examination duly proved before the chamberlain of the said city for the time being, and the same reported by the mouth of the said chamberlain at a court to be holden by the mayor and the aldermen of the same city in their council chamber, that as well the said master as the said apprentice shall for evermore be disfranchised. God save the King. Maitland, Vol. IPP. 229-230, to which was added an admonition to the apprentices, Ye shall constantly and devoutly on your knees, every day, serve God morning and evening, and make conscience in the due hearing of the word preached, and endeavour the right practice thereof on your life and conversation. You shall do diligent and faithful service to your master for the time of your apprenticeship, and deal truly in what you shall be trusted. You shall often read over the covenants of your indenture, and see and endeavour yourself to perform the same, to the utmost of your power. You shall avoid all evil company, and all occasions which may tend to draw you to the same, and make speedy return when you shall be sent of your master's and mistress's business. You shall be of fair, gentle, and lowly speech and behaviour towards all men, and especially to all your governors. And according to your carriage, expect your reward for good or ill from God and your friends. Maitland, Vol. IP 230. The History of Evil May Day, p. 24, is an illustration of the growing turbulence of the prentices, and the relaxation of order and discipline in the city generally. The wards, in fact, had become too thickly populated for the old and simple rule of a peripatetic alderman and his sergeants. The turbulence was a sign of their weakness, yet 300 years were to pass before an efficient night and day police could be established as the only remedy. In the year 1582, an ordinance concerning the apparel of the prentice shows still more clearly that he was getting out of hand. It was enacted by the Lord Mayor and Common Council, that from henceforth no apprentice whatsoever should presume, 1 to 325, wear any apparel but what he receives from his master. 2. To wear no hat within the city and liberty thereof, nor anything instead thereof than a woolen cap without any silk in or about the same. 3. To wear no ruffles, cuffs, loose collar, nor other thing than a ruff at the collar, and that only of a yard and a half long. 4. To wear no doublets but what were made of canvas, fustian, sackcloth, English leather, or woolen cloth, and without being enriched with any manner of gold, silver, or silk. 5. To wear no other coloured cloth or kersey in hose or stockings than white, blue, or russet. 6. To wear little breeches of the same stuffs as the doublets, and without being stitched, laced, or bordered. 7. To wear a plain upper coat of cloth or leather without pinking, stitching, edging, or silk about it. 8. To wear no other surtout than a cloth gown or cloak, lined or faced with cloth, cotton, or baize, with a fixed round collar, without stitching, garding, lace, or silk. 9. To wear no pumps, slippers, nor shoes, but of English leather, without being pinked, edged, or stitched, nor girdles nor garters, other than of crewel, woolen, thread, or leather, without being garnished. 10. To wear no sword, dagger, or other weapon but a knife, nor a ring, jewel of gold, nor silver, nor silk in any part of the apparel. It was likewise further enacted, that every apprentice offending against any of the above-mentioned items was for the first offence to be punished at the discretion of his master, for the second to be publicly whipped at the hall of his company, and for the third to serve 6 months longer than specified in his indentures. And every master conniving at the crimes of his apprentice committed against the tenor of the premises should for every such offence forfeit to the poor of the parish, wherein he dwelt 6 shillings and 8 pence. It was also farther ordained that no apprentice should frequent or go to any dancing, fencing, or musical schools, nor keep any chest, press, or other place for the keeping of apparel or goods, but in his master's house under the penalties aforesaid. And every such master permitting or allowing his apprentice to offend in any of the said cases, to forfeit as in the case of forbidden apparel. Maitland, Vol. IP 267. Maitland, after praising this wise ordinance, laments that in his time, the middle of the 18th century, there could not be some such good law passed to restrain the more destructive practices of our modern apprentices, viz., keeping mistresses, keeping horses, frequenting tavern clubs and playhouses, and their great excesses in clothes, linen, periwigs, gold and silver watches, etc. He does not tell us where they got the money for these expensive luxuries, but in the Confession of Latron Meriton, 1650, the way is fully explained. It was, namely, by robbing their masters. In the year 1595 there were more troubles caused by the prentices. The Queen ordered sharp measures to be taken. And because such assemblies and routs were compounded of sundry sorts of base people, some known apprentices, such as were of base manual occupations, some others, wandering idle persons of condition, rogues and vagabonds, and some colouring their wandering by the name of soldiers returning from the wars, etc. Therefore she had notified her pleasure to her council, to prescribe certain orders to be published in and about the said city, which she would have straitly observed, and for that purpose that she meant to have a provost-marshal with sufficient authority to apprehend all such as should not be readily reformed and corrected by the ordinary officers of justice, and them without delay to execute upon the gallows by order of martial law. At our manor of Greenwich, the 4th of July, 1595, Maitland, Vol. IPP, 278-279. Sir Thomas Welford, accordingly, was appointed provost-marshal. He patrolled the streets with a number of horsemen armed with pistols. He arrested many of the rioters who were tried at the Guildhall. 5 of them were executed on Tower Hill, and the rioting ceased. Of the apprentices, riot against the Spanish ambassador in 1640, one we have heard in another place, London in the time of the Stuarts, p. 38. The Lord Mayor had a good deal of trouble in appeasing the ambassador, who said that he hardly knew how to call that a city or even a society of rational creatures, which was seemingly divested both of humanity and government. At the outbreak of civil war, the prentices were on the side of the Parliament, and enjoyed many opportunities of demonstrating their views and opinions, not only without reproach, but rather with the approbation of the parliamentary party, the leaders of which encouraged the young fellows to enlist in their army, as, for example, by the following proclamation: Whereas in times of common danger and necessity the interests of private persons ought to give way to public, it is ordained and declared by the Lords and Commons in Parliament that such apprentices as have been, or shall be listed to serve as soldiers, for the defence of the religion and liberty of the kingdom, His Majesty's royal person, the Parliament, and the City of London, their sureties, and such as stand engaged for them, shall be secured against their masters, their executors and administrators, from all loss and inconvenience by forfeiture of bonds, covenants, enfranchisement, or other ways. And that, after this public service ended, the masters of such apprentices shall be commanded and required to receive them again into their service, without imposing upon them any punishment, loss, or prejudice, for their absence in the defence of the Commonwealth. And the Lords and Commons do further declare, that if it shall appear that the masters of such apprentices have received any considerable loss by the absence of their apprentices, they will take care that reasonable satisfaction be 327 made unto them out of the public stock of the kingdom, according to justice and indifferency. Maitland, Vol. IP 361. In 1647 2 petitions of the young men and apprentices were drawn up and presented to the House of Lords by the 2 factions in the city, that in the interest of the king being signed by 10,000 hands, instigated, says Maitland, by their masters. The action and attitude of the city on this occasion belong to its general history. The custom and practice as concerns apprentices in the 18th century are laid down by Strype in his account of the duties and rules of the Chamberlain's court. Before him, the said Chamberlain, all apprentices are enrolled and made free, insomuch that none can set up shop, or follow a trade within the city or liberties, if not a freeman, and sworn before him. Neither can any one turn over an apprentice, but by his licence. To him all complaints are brought for differences betwixt apprentices and their masters, who reconciles their differences, and may punish by imprisonment those that disobey his summons, or any apprentice that misdemeans himself to his master or mistress. But upon the apprentice's acknowledging his fault, and begging pardon with promise never to offend any more, his fault is forgiven. Such apprentices as have justly served their term of 7 years, and not broken their indentures by marrying, etc., are made free. Upon the admission of every person into the freedom of this city, the Chamberlain causeth an oath to be administered unto him, to be true to the king, the government, and observe and keep the customs of the city, which said oath hath been mentioned before, chap. Roman 23. If any master shall refuse to make his apprentice free, when the term of his indenture is expired, upon complaint made to the Chamberlain, he will cause such master to be summoned before him, and if he cannot show good cause to the contrary, will make the apprentice free. And if an apprentice shall be unruly or disorderly in his master's house, or commit any notorious fault, upon complaint made thereof, the Chamberlain will send one of his officers for such apprentice, and send him to Bridewell, or otherwise punish him according to the nature of the offence. If any master shall misuse his apprentice by unreasonable beating, not allowing him necessaries, or by neglecting to instruct him, or the like upon complaint thereof made, the Chamberlain will send a summons for the master to appear before him, and upon due hearing both parties will relieve the apprentice if his allegations be proved to be just, or else leave the apprentice to take his remedy against his master in the Lord Mayor's court. And if the 328 master refuse to appear according to his summons, the Lord Mayor and Recorder, upon complaint thereof made unto them, will grant a warrant to take him, and compel him to appear. when an apprentice, by the consent of his master, is to be turned over to another master of the same trade, it must be done before the chamberlain, and it is observed that, if an apprentice be turned over by the company only of which the master is free, it is no obligation on the second master to keep such an apprentice, nor is the apprentice compelled thereby to serve the second master, but may depart at pleasure, by suing out his indentures against the first master, which may be done without the privity or knowledge of the second master. And therefore it is absolutely necessary that all apprentices should be turned over before the chamberlain, and thereby the first master is discharged from him, and the second obliged to keep him, and the apprentice will be obliged to serve the second master the full term of his indentures, although the same were made for 9 years or more. It is the interest of every master and apprentice, when any difference happens between them, to refer the matter to the chamberlain, who will freely hear both parties and decide the controversy for 3s. Charge, viz., 1s, to the officer for the summons, and 2s, to the clerk for the order, whereas if they proceed at law for relief, it may probably cost both parties £6 or more in charges, and the conclusion may be less satisfactory than if decided by the chamberlain. The fees due to the city for making free, and the enrolling apprentices. An apprentice made free and not enrolled, the master pays 0.13.2. The apprentice pays 0.20. If turned over before the chamberlain, the master or mistress must pay extraordinary 0.20. And by virtue of the late Act for orphans, over and above these usual fees, an apprentice when bound must pay 0.26, and when admitted a freeman 0.50. If an apprentice shall omit to take his freedom, within convenient time after the expiration of his indentures, the chamberlain may impose upon the apprentice such a fine, in reason as he shall think fit, for this neglect without just cause to the contrary. Every freeman ought to take particular care not to make an apprentice free of London, by testifying for his true service, unless such apprentice shall 329 have really served him. For if he shall privately turn his apprentice over to a foreigner, and let his apprentice serve such a foreigner, and yet testify to the chamberlain that the apprentice served a freeman, in such case both the master and the apprentice may be disfranchised, and fined at the discretion of the recorder, and the chamberlain, and may cause the freeman's shop to be shut up. Stripe Vol. Roman 2, pp. 475-476. As regards the ancient costume of an apprentice, I again quote Stowe and Stripe. The ancient habit of the apprentices of London was a flat round cap, hair close cut, narrow falling bands, coarse side coats, close hose, cloth stockings, and other such severe apparel. When this garb had been urged by some to the disparagement of apprentices, as a token of servitude, one many a year ago, undertaking the defence of these apprentices, wrote thus, that this imported the commendable thrift of the citizens, and was only the mark of an apprentice's vocation and calling, and which anciently no question was the ordinary habit of a citizen, which point of ancient discipline, he said, the grave common lawyers do still retain in their profession, for the professors of that learning, we see, do at this present retain the party-coloured coats of serving-men at their sergeants' feasts, and he wished that the remembrance of this ancient livery might be preserved by the grave citizens, in setting apart a particular time or day for the feast of their apprenticeship, when they should wear their former apprentices' garb, making profession in this way that they gloried in the ensigns of their honest apprenticeship. In the time of Queen Mary, the beginning of Queen Elizabeth, as well as many years before, all apprentices wore blue cloaks in the summer, and blue gowns in the winter, but it was not lawful for any man, either servant or other, to wear their gowns lower than the calves of their legs, except they were above 80 years of age. But the length of cloaks being not limited, they made them down to their shoes. Their breeches and stockings were usually of white broadcloth, viz., round slops, and their stockings sewed up close thereto, as if they were all but one piece. They also wore flat caps both then and many years after, as well apprentices as journeymen and others, both at home and abroad, whom the pages of the court in derision called flat caps. When apprentices and journeymen attended upon their masters and mistresses in the night, they went before them carrying a lanthorn and candle in their hands, and a great long club on their necks, and many well-grown sturdy apprentices used to wear long daggers in the daytime on their backs or sides. Anciently it was the general use and custom of all apprentices in London, mercers only excepted, being commonly merchants and of better rank as it seems, to carry water tankards, to serve their masters' houses with water, fetched either from the Thames or the common conduits of London. It was a great matter in former times to give £10 to bind a youth apprentice, but in King James I's time they gave 20, 40, 60 and sometimes £100 with an apprentice, but now these prices are vastly enhanced to £500, £600 or £800. Stripe vol Roman II. The question in 1628 arose and was solemnly argued whether an apprentice who is certainly bound to obedience, who must perform servile offices, who is corrected by his master, clothed by his master and fed by his master, is or is not in a state of bondage or a bondsman. The question was resolved by Philipart, Somerset Herald, to the effect that he could not be considered a bondsman. The reason we may pass over, but Stripe's remarks are interesting. So that apprenticeship in London is no dishonour nor degradation, but rather an honour and a degree. He is very hardy that shall embass honest industry with disgraceful censures, and too unjust, who shall not cherish and encourage it with praise and worship, as the ancient policy of England did and doth, in constituting corporations, and adorning the companies with banners of arms, and especial members thereof with notes of nobility. And as it is an honour, so it is a degree or order of good regular subjects, out of whose, as it were, noviceship or colleges, citizens are supplied from time to time. We call them colleges, according to the old Roman law phrase, or fellowships of men, for so indeed they are, comprehended within several corporations, or bodies of free persons, intended to be consociated together for commerce, according to conscience and justice, and named companies. So that apprentices, according to the esteem of our commonwealth, when first they come to be apprentices, first begin to be somebody, who before were young men without any vocation in the world, and so by other ascents or steps come to be freemen of London, or citizens, thence to be of their companies' liveries, governors of companies as wardens and masters, and governors in the city as common councilmen, aldermen's deputies, sheriffs and aldermen, and lastly the principal governors or heads of the city, that is, lord mayors. And some also have been advanced from being citizens to be councillors of state to the prince. It is further evident that apprenticeship doth not deprive of gentry, for no man loseth his right to bear arms or to write gentleman, unless he be attainted in law for such a cause, the conviction whereof doth immediately procure corruption in blood, which in this case no man yet hath dreamt of. The apprentice hath no more lost his title and right to gentry, than he hath done to any goods, chattels, lands, royalties, or anything else, which if he had never been any apprentice either had, might, or ought to have come unto him. The 331 rights of blood are more inherent than the rights of fortune, according to the law rule, jura sanguinem nullo jure civili dirimi passant, i.e. the law of bloods cannot be destroyed by any civil right. That gentry is a right of blood, may appear by this, that no man can truly alienate the same, or vest another in it, though legally he may in case of adoption, which is but a human invention in imitation of nature. And in the truth of the thing, no alienation at all, but a fiction, or an acceptation in law, as if it were such. Gentry is a quality of blood, as virtue and learning are of one mind. This is the sum of what that learned herald argued, in confutation of that opinion, that apprenticeship extinguisheth gentry. And he sent this his discourse to the gentleman who desired his judgment herein, whence, no question, he received full satisfaction, and the herald took the more pains in confuting this false conceit, that it was a thing unbeseeming a gentleman to be an apprentice to a citizen or burgess, because it had filled England with more vices, and sacrificed more serviceable bodies to odious ends, and more souls to sinful lives, than perhaps any one other uncivil opinion whatsoever. For they who held it better to rob by land or sea than to beg or labour did daily fee and feel, that out of apprentices rose such as set upon them, standing out for lives as malefactors, when they a shame and sorrow to their kindred underwent a fortune too unworthy. Stripe vol Roman II, pp. 435-436. Apprentices in certain cases ought to be discharged. One was discharged from his master, because his master held no shop and withdrew himself from the city. Another because his master did not teach him. Another because his master was in Ludgate and entrusted him not. Another because not enrolled within a year. Another because his master was distracted in his mind. Another because his master was so poor that he could not exhibit to him. Another because his master diverted himself to other occupations than his own mystery. Another because the master was a leper. Another because the wife after the death of her husband taught him not. And lastly another because his master inordinately chastised him. Stripe vol Roman II, p. 438. The decay of order among apprentices may finish these notes on the class. I come in the next place to treat of attorneys, clerks, apprentices, inferior tradesmen, coachmen, porters, servants, and the lowest class of men in this town, which are far the most numerous, And first of the lawyers, clerks, and apprentices, I find it a general complaint that they are under no manner of government. Before their times are half out, they set up for gentlemen, they dress, they drink, they game, frequent the playhouses, and intrigue with the women. And it is a common thing with clerks to bully their masters, and desert their service for whole days and nights, whenever they see fit. And indeed 332 people consider little else at this day in the choice of clerks or apprentices, but the sums they are to have with them. 1, 2, or 300 pounds are given with a clerk or apprentice, who may be looked upon rather as a boarder than a servant. He takes little care of his master's business, and the master as little to instruct him in the mystery of his profession. Stripe Vol. Roman 2, p. 559. Chapter 6. The London Inns. The town was full of inns, more especially they were established without the gates and in the borough. A great change had come over the inns. Formerly the inn was a place of lodging. Some of them, as the Inns of Court, Barnard's Inn, Gray's Inn, Staple Inn, were colleges of residence. The business of providing food and drink belonged to the tavern and the cook's shop. We have now come to the time when the inn itself provided food. Fortunately, there remain two very useful descriptions of the inns of this time. One of them is by Harrison in Holinshed, and the other by Fiennes Morrison. First, let us take that of Harrison. Those towns that we call thoroughfares have great and sumptuous inns, builded in them for the receiving of such travellers and strangers as pass to and fro. The manner of harbouring wherein is not like to that of some other countries, in which the host or goodman of the house doth challenge a lordly authority over his guests, but clean otherwise, sith every man may use his inn as his own house in England, and have for his money how great or little variety of victuals, and what other service himself shall think expedient to call for. Our inns are also very well furnished with napery, bedding, and tapissery, especially with napery, for beside the linen used at the tables, which is commonly washed daily, is such and so much as belongeth unto the estate and calling of the guest. Each comer is sure to lie in clean sheets, wherein no man hath been lodged since they came from the landress, or out of the water wherein they were last washed. If the traveller have an horse, his bed doth cost him nothing, but if he go on foot, he is sure to pay a penny for the same. But whether he be horseman or footman, if his chamber be once appointed, he may carry the kye with him, as of his own house so long as he lodgeth there. If he loose aughts whilst he abideth in the inn, the host is bound by a general custom to restore the damage, so that there is no greater security anywhere for travellers than in the greatest inns of England. Their horses in like sort are walked, dressed, and looked unto by certain hostelers or hired servants, appointed at the charges of the good man of the house, who in hope of extraordinary 334 reward will deal very diligently after outward appearance in this, their function and calling. Herein nevertheless are many of them blameworthy, in that they do not only deceive the beast oftentimes of his allowance of sundry means, except their owners look well to them, but also make such pacts with slipper merchants which hunt after prey, for what place is sure from evil and wicked persons, that many an honest man is spoiled of his goods as he travelleth to and fro, in which fear also the counsel of the tapsters or drawers of drink, and chamberlains is not seldom behind or wanting. Certes I believe not that chapman or traveller in England is robbed by the wayer without the knowledge of some of them, for when he cometh into the inn, and alighteth from his horse, the hostler forthwith is very busy to take down his budget or cap case in the yard from his saddle bow, which he piseth slily in his hand to feel the weight thereof, or he miss of this pitch when the guest hath taken up his chamber, the chamberlain that looketh to the making of the beds will be sure to remove it from the place where the owner hath set it, as if it were to set it more conveniently somewhere else, whereby he getteth an inkling whether it be money or other short wares, and thereof giveth warning to such guests as haunt the house, and are of his confederacy to the utter undoing of many an honest yeoman as he journeyeth by the wayer. The tapster in like sort for his part doth mark his behaviour, and what plenty of money he draweth when he payeth the shot, to the like end, so that it shall be an hard matter to escape all their subtle practices. Some think it a gay matter to commit their budgets at their coming to the goodman of the house, but thereby they oft bewray themselves, for albeit their money be safe for the time that it is in his hands, for you shall not hear that a man is robbed in his inn, yet after their departure the host can make no warranties of the same, sith his protection extendeth no further than the gate of his own house, and there cannot be a surer token unto such as pry and watch for those booties, than to see any guest deliver his cap case in such manner. In all our inns we have plenty of ale, beer, and sundry kinds of wine, and such is the capacity of some of them that they are able to lodge 200 or 300 persons, and their horses at ease, and thereto with a very short warning make such provision for their diet as to him that is unacquainted withal may seem to be incredible. Howbeit of all in England, there are no worse inns than in London, and yet many are there far better than the best that I have heard of in any foreign countries, if all circumstances be duly considered. But to leave this and go in hand with my purpose, I will here set down a table of the best thoroughfares and towns of greatest travel in England, in some of which there are 12 or 16 such inns at the least, as I before did speak of, and it is a world to see how each owner of them contendeth with other for goodness of entertainment of the guests, as 335 about finesse and change of linen, furniture of bedding, beauty of rooms, service at the table, costliness of plate, strength of drink, variety of wines, or well-using of horses. Finally, there is not much omitted among them as the gorgeousness of their vari signs at their doors, wherein some do consume 30 or 40 pounds, a mere vanity in mine opinion, but so vain will they needs be, and that not only to give some outward token of the innkeeper's wealth, but also to procure good guests to the frequenting of their houses, in hope there to be well used. Holinshed's Chronicles. Concerning the customs in English inns, finds Morrison thus writes: For as soon as a passenger comes to an inn, the servants run to him, and one takes his horse and walks him till he be cold, then rubs him and gives him meat. Yet I must say that they are not much to be trusted in this last point, without the eye of the master or his servant to oversee them. Another servant gives the passenger his private chamber, and kindles his fear, the third pulls of his boots and makes them clean. Then the host or hostess visits him, and if he will eat with the host or at a common table with others, his meal will cost him 6 pence, or in some places but 4 pence, yet this course is less honourable and not used by gentlemen. But if he will eat in his chamber, he commands what meats he will according to his appetite, and as much as he thinks fit for him and his company, yea, the kitchen is open to him to command the meat to be dressed as he likes best. And when he sits at table, the host or hostess will accompany him, if they have many guests will at least visit him, taking it for courtesy to be bid sit down. While he eats, if he have company especially, he shall be offered music, which he may freely take or refuse, and if he be solitary the musicians will give him the good day with music in the morning. It is the custom, and no way disgraceful, to set up part of supper for his breakfast, in the evening or in the morning after breakfast, for the common sort use not to dine, but ride from breakfast to supper time, yet coming early to the inn for better resting of their horses. He shall have a reckoning in writing, and if it seems unreasonable the host will satisfy him either for the due price, or by abating part, especially if the servant deceive him in any way, which one of experience will soon find. I will now only add that a gentleman and his man shall spend as much as if he were accompanied with another gentleman and his man, and if gentlemen will in such sort join together to eat at one table, the expenses will be much diminished. Lastly, a man cannot more freely command at home in his own house than he may do in his inn, and at parting if he gives some few pence to the chamberlain and ostler they wish him a happy journey. And further, in all inns, but especially in suspected places, let him take heed of his 336 chamber fellows, and always have his sword by his side or by his bedside. Let him lay his purse under his pillow, but always folded with his garters or something he first useth in the morning, lest he forget to put it on before he go out of his chamber. And to the end, he may leave nothing behind him in his inns, let the visiting of his chamber and gathering his things together be the last thing he doth before he put his foot into the stirrup. The list of Elizabethan taverns might be compiled at great length, but the following signs celebrated in verse will suffice. Through the Royal Exchange as I walked, where gallants in satin did shine, at midst of the day they parted away. At several places to dine, the gentry went to the King's Head, the nobles went unto the Crown, the knights unto the Golden Fleece, and the ploughmen to the Clowns. The clergy will dine at the Mitre, the vintners at the 3 Tuns, the usurers to the devil will go, and the friars unto the nuns. The ladies will dine at the Feathers, the Globe no captain will scorn, the huntsmen will go to the Greyhound below, and some townsmen to the Horn. The plumber will dine at the Fountain, the cooks at the Holy Lamb, the drunkards at noon to the Man in the Moon, and the cuckolds to the Ram. The rovers will dine at the Lion, the watermen at the Old Swan, the bards will to the Negro go, and the whores to the Naked Man. The keepers will to the White Hart, the mariners unto the ship. The beggars they must take their way to the for example shell and the whip. The farrier will to the horse, the blacksmith unto the lock, the butchers to the bull will go, and the carman to Bridewell dock, the fishmongers unto the dolphin, the bakers to the cheat loaf, the turners unto the table will go, where they may merrily quaff, the tailors will dine at the shears, the shoemakers will to the boot, the Welshmen they will take their way, and dine at the sign of the goat, the hosiers will dine at the leg, and drapers at the sign of the brush, the Fletchers to Robin Hood will go, and the spendthrift to Beggar's Bush, the pewterers to Quart Pot, the coopers will dine at the hoop, the cobblers to the last will go, and the bargemen to the scoop, the carpenters will dine at the axe, the colliers will dine at the sack, your fruiterer he to the cherry tree, good fellows no liquor will lack, the goldsmiths to the 3 cups, their money they count as dross, your Puritan to the pewter can, and your papist to the cross, the weavers will dine at the shuttle, the glovers will into the glove, the maidens all to the maidenhead, and true lovers unto the dove, the saddlers will dine at the saddle, the painters to the green dragon, the Dutchman will go to the sign of the Vrow, where each man may drink his flagon, the chandlers will dine at the scales, the salters at the sign of the bag, the porters take pain at the labour in vain, and the horse-courser to the white nag, thus every man to his humour, from the north unto the south, but he that hath no money in his purse may dine at the sign of the mouth, the swaggerers will dine at the fencers, but those that have lost their wits, with Bedlam Tom let there be their home, and the drum the drummer best hits, the cheater will dine at the checker, the pickpocket at the blind alehouse, till taken and tried up Holborn they ride, and make their end at the gallows. In a black-letter poem called News from Bartholomew Fair occurs the following short list of taverns. There hath been great sale and utterance of wine, besides beer and ale and ipocras fine, in every country, region and nation, but chiefly in Billingsgate at the Salutation, and at the Boar's Head near London Stone, the Swan at Dowgate, a tavern well known, the Mitre in Cheap, and then the Bull Head, and many like places that make noses red, the Boar's Head in Old Fish Street, 3 Cranes in the Vintry, and now of late St. Martin's in the Sentry, the Windmill in Lothbury, the Ship at Th Exchange, King's Head in New Fish Street, where roisterers do range, the Mermaid in Cornhill, Red Lion in the Strand, 3 Tons in Newgate Market, Old Fish Street at the Swan, Heywood 1608 writes, the gentry to the King's Head, the nobles to the Crown, the knights unto the Golden Fleece, and to the plough the clowns, the churchman to the mitre, the shepherd to the star, the gardener hies him to the rose, to the drum the man of war, to the feathers ladies you, the globe, the seaman doth not scorn, the usurer to the devil and the townsman to the horn, the huntsman to the White Hart, to the ship the merchants go, but you who do the muses love, the sign called River Po, the banquer out to the world's end, the fool to the fortune pie, unto the mouth the oyster wife, the fiddler to the pie, the punk unto the cockatrice, the drunkard to the vine, the beggar to the bush then meet, and with Duke Humphrey dine. It was the custom at taverns to send presents of wine from one room to another with compliments. The taverns were to the 16th century what the coffee houses were to the 18th. Every man frequented his tavern. Clubs were held in the taverns. Men of the same trade met in the taverns for evening discourse. Bargains and business affairs were conducted in taverns. There were good and bad taverns. Those like the Boar's Head, East Cheap, bore a bad character. That is to say, they were laden down by the character of Doll Tearsheet. Others, again, where Doll and her friends were not admitted, were frequented by the most respectable merchants and divines. Music was going on in most of them all day long. and all day long the waiters, clad in blue and wearing white aprons, ran about with flasks of wine and cups, and tobacco and pipes, calling anon, anon, and stopping to chalk a score upon the wall. It is strange that Stowe mentions neither the Boar's Head, East Cheap, which must have been a well-known tavern, or Shakespeare would not have chosen it for the haunt of the Prince and Falstaff, nor the Mermaid, the haunt of Ben Jonson and the poets. Presumably the worthy antiquary would not have felt at home in the company of the wits. The Boar's Head stood in that part of East Cheap now swept away. The statue of King William Roman IV marks the site. It was not an ancient tavern. There were no taverns formerly in East Cheap according to Stowe. The first mention of it is in the year 1537. The courtyard was large enough for the performance of plays. At the back it looked out upon St. Michael's churchyard. The churchyard and church of St. Michael were swept away to make the approach to New London Bridge. Between St. Michael's Lane, now Miles's Lane, and a small alley, stood 4 taverns in a row: the Chicken, the Boar's Head, the Plough, and the Three Kings. These taverns were thus in the midst of markets, the grass market in front, the fish market on the east, the meat market on the west. The tavern was rebuilt after the fire in 1668. The new sign then made for it may be seen in the Guildhall Museum. On each side of the doorway was carved in wood a vine branch, rising 3 feet from the ground, loaded with leaves and clusters, and on the top of each a figure of Falstaff 8 inches high. Before its demolition the house had ceased to be a tavern. Here was held a club of which Boswell was a member, in which everyone assumed a Shakespearean character. It was the custom to hold convivial meetings in this house. There Falstaff and Dame Quickly and Doll Tearsheet and the whole merry company became real. Goldsmith wrote his essay, A Reverie, in this tavern, and here Washington Irving gave full play to his fancy, and restored the things that never were to the place that never knew Prince Hal. Sign of the Boar's Head in East Cheap. The Mermaid Tavern stood between Friday Street and Bread Street, with an entrance from Cheapside as well. The tavern has been immortalized by a poet of the 17th and one of the 19th century. Francis Beaumont the former writes to Ben Jonson, What things have we seen? Done at the Mermaid, heard words that have been so nimble and so full of subtle flame, as if that every one from whence they came had meant to put his whole wit in a jest, and had resolved to live a fool the rest of his dull life. Then when there hath been thrown wit able enough to justify the town for 3 days past, wit that might warrant be for the whole city to talk foolishly, till that were cancelled, and when that was gone, we left an air behind us, which alone was able to make the 2 next companies right witty, though but downright fools more wise. And Keats the latter writes, Souls of poets dead and gone, what Elysium have ye known? Happy field or mossy cavern, choicer than the Mermaid Tavern? Have ye tippled drink more fine than mine host's canary wine? Or, as Fuller says of Shakespeare, many were the wit combats betwixt him and Ben Jonson, which 2 I behold like a Spanish great galleon and an English man of war. Master Jonson, like the former, was built far higher in learning, solid but slow in his performances. Shakespeare, with the English man of war, lesser in bulk but lighter in sailing, could turn with all tides, tack about and take advantage of all winds by the quickness of his wit and invention. Lists of old taverns are, as a rule, without interest. There are, however, a few of the London taverns of historic importance. 2 have been mentioned. Thus, the Nag's Head at the corner of Friday Street was the pretended scene of the consecration of Parker, Archbishop of Canterbury, in 1559. At the northwest of St. Paul's Churchyard was an ancient tavern known as the Mitre. Here were given the concerts of the Society of Musicians, and their arms, representing the lyre of Apollo, with the crest of the swan, being put up in the front of the house, caused the original sign to be jocularly transformed into that of the goose and gridiron. The swan with 3 necks meant originally the swan with 3 nicks or marks to denote ownership. The Bell Savage was originally the bell, but its landlord being a man named Savage, the house was emblazoned with a bell and a savage man beside it. The Elephant and Castle became the Pig and Tinder Box. The Cat and Fiddle, the Governor of Calais, became the Cat and Fiddle. Fleet Street had many well-known taverns. Like those in the city, they were mostly approached by narrow alleys leading out of the street, as the Rainbow, Dick's, and the Mitre. Dick's stands on the site of the printing office of Richard Tottle, law stationer in the reign of Henry VIII. The Cock, later moved across the road, was one of the most famous of the Fleet Street taverns. The Devil Tavern, however, was more famous even than the Mermaid. Ben Jonson drew the company from the latter tavern to the Devil. He lived at Temple Bar in order to be near the tavern. Here he founded the Apollo Club and wrote his famous rules in Latin, which were translated into English by one of his sons, Brome. Near the door was placed a gilt bust of Apollo with a welcome in flowing lines. Welcome all who lead or follow to the oracle of Apollo. Here he speaks out of his pottle, or the tripass his tower bottle. All his answers are divine. Truth itself doth flow in wine. Hang up all the poor hop drinkers, cries old Sim, the king of skinkers. He the life of life abuses, that sits watering with the muses. Those dull girls no good can mean us. Wine, it is the milk of Venus, and the poet's horse accounted. Ply it and you all are mounted. Tease the true pH by and liquor. Cheers the brains, makes wit the quicker. Pays all debts, cures all diseases, and at once 3 senses pleases. Welcome all who lead or follow to the oracle of Apollo. The merchants conducted their business in the Royal Exchange, but the tavern was the place where the lesser traders, and the shopkeepers, and the people who came up from the country met, to arrange bargains and business of all kinds over a flask of canary. Chapter 7. Theatres. The latter half of the 16th century presents a remarkable development of the drama and of the theatres in London. This development was like the rising tide. It advanced with a force that was irresistible. The mayor and aldermen did their best to drive out plays and players from their boundaries. They went, but they established themselves beyond the limits of the city jurisdiction. Preachers denounced the theatre, moralists wrote pamphlets against it, yet it flourished more and more. John Stockwood, preaching at Paul's Cross, says, "Have we not houses of purpose, built with great charges for the maintenance of them, and that without the liberties, as who shall say, there, let them say what they will, we will play. I know not how I might, with the godly learned especially, more discommend the gorgeous playing place erected in the fields, than term it, as they please to have it called, a theatre." In the same sermon he asks, "Will not a filth I play with the blast of a trumpet sooner call thither 1,343, than an hour's tolling of a bell bring to the sermon 100? Nay, even here in the city, without it be at this place and some other certain ordinary audience, where shall you find a reasonable company? Whereas if you resort to the theatre, the curtain, and other places of players in the city, you shall on the Lord's day have these places, with many other that I cannot reckon, so full as possible they can throng. The Bear Garden and the Globe Theatre." From Vischer's Panorama of London. The Londoners might change their religion, but they were not going to change their sports. They were Protestant instead of Catholic, but they kept up their bear-baiting, their bull-baiting, their archery, their wrestlings, their fencing, their quarterstaff play, their running at the quinton, their feats of tumbling, their Morris dances and mummings, their plays and interludes. But the Reformation killed the miracle play. The play of modern manners, or the tragedy, or the farce, took the place of the religious play, and instead of acting on a stage in a churchyard, the players now began to act in the broad and ample courtyard of the inn, whose galleries afforded room for people to look on. The authorities looked on the play from the beginning with eyes of disfavour. The actor was considered a masterless man. He had no trade. He was a strolling vagabond. He lived upon the largesse of those who looked on at his performance. He was a buffoon who would assume any character at will to make the people laugh and cry. He must be able to dance and posture like the tumblers on the road. Again, all the idle people in the city assembled to see the play. All the vicious people crowded to take advantage of the throng. In the theatre every day arose disorders and brawls. Young men of sober parentage were seduced into becoming players. Witness the words of Prynne. Our own experience can sufficiently inform us that plays and playhouses are the frequent causes of many murders, duels, quarrels, debates, occasioned sometimes by reason of some difference about a box, a seat, a place upon the stage, sometimes by intruding too boldly into some female's company, sometimes by reason of some amorous, scurrilous, or disgraceful words that are uttered of or to some female spectators, sometimes by reason of some speeches or passages of the play, particularly applied to some persons present or absent, sometimes by reason of some husband or co-rival's jealousy or affront, whose wife or mistress, being there in person, is perhaps solicited, abused, or jeered at in his presence, sometimes by reason of the apprentices who resort to playhouses, especially on Shrove Tuesday, sometimes by means of other accidents and occasions. Many have been the murders, more the quarrels, the duels that have grown from our stage plays, whose large encomiums of rash valour, duels, fortitude, generosity, impatiency, homicides, tyranny, and revenge, do so exasperate men's raging passions, and make them so impatient of the very smallest injury, that nothing can satisfy, can expiate but the offender's blood. Hence it is that some players, some play-haunters, now living, not satisfied with the murder of one, have imbrued their barbarous unchristian hands in the blood of 2, of 3, if not of 4 several men. And so far are they from ruing the odiousness of these their bloody deeds, that they glory in the number of their murders as the very trophies of their valour. The Queen at the beginning of her reign issued a proclamation to prevent players performing without licence, and from handling politics or religion. In 344-1572, the mayor forbade the acting of plays in London on the ground of the plague, and the danger of infection. Harrison says, "Plays are banished for a time out of London, lest the resort unto them should engender a plague, or rather disperse it, being already begun. Would to God these command plays were exiled altogether, as seminaries of impiety, and their theatres pulled down, as no better than houses of bawdry. It is an evident token of a wicked time when players wax so rich that they can build such houses, as much I wish also to our command bear-baitings used on the Sabbath days." Holinshed's Chronicles. In 1574, the first steps were taken towards the regulation of players and plays. The preamble to the ordinances is set forth by Maitland, with the ordinances themselves, as follows. The citizens in common council observing, that the antient and innocent recreation of stage plays or interludes, which in former days ingenious tradesmen and gentlemen's servants sometimes practised, to expose vice, or to represent the noble actions of their ancestors, at certain festival times or in private houses at weddings, and at other splendid entertainments for their own profit, was now in process of time become an occupation, and that many there were that followed it for a livelihood, and which was worse, that it was become the occasion of much sin and evil. Great multitudes of people, especially youth in Queen Elizabeth's reign, resorting to these plays, and being commonly acted on Sundays and festivals, the churches were forsaken, and the playhouses thronged, and great disorders and inconvenience were found to ensue to the city thereby, forasmuch as it occasioned frays and evil practices of incontinency. Great inns were used for this purpose, which had secret chambers and places, as well as open stages and galleries, where maids, especially orphans and good citizens' children under age, were inveigled and allured to privy and unmeet contracts, and where unchaste, uncomely and unshamefaced speeches and doings were published, where there was an unthrifty waste of the money of the poor, sundry robberies by picking and cutting purses, uttering of popular and seditious matter, many corruptions of youth and other enormities, besides sundry slaughters and maimings of the Queen's subjects, by falling of scaffolds, frames and stages, and by engines, weapons, and powder, used in the plays, and believing that in the time of God's visitation by the plague, such assemblies of the people in throngs and presses were very dangerous for spreading the infection, they regulated these plays, lest the people, upon God's gracious withdrawing of the sickness, should with sudden forgetting of the visitation, without fear of God's wrath, and without some respect of those good and politic means, as the words of the Act ran, that were ordained for the preservation of the commonwealth and people in health and good order, return to the undue use of such enormities. Therefore, for the lawful, honest, comely 345 use of plays, pastimes and recreations in good sort permitted by the authority of the Common Council, it was enacted, I that no play should be openly played within the liberty of the city, wherein should be uttered any words, examples, or doings of any unchastity, sedition, or such like unfit and uncomely matter, upon pain of imprisonment for the space of 14 days, and £5 for every such offence. Roman 2. That no innkeeper, tavern-keeper, or other person, whatsoever within the liberties of the city, shall show or play, or cause to be showed or played, within his house or yard any play, which shall not first be perused and allowed by the Lord Mayor and Court of Aldermen's order. Roman 3. No person shall suffer any plays to be played in his house or yard, whereof he then shall have rule, but only such persons, and in such places as upon good consideration shall be thereunto permitted and allowed by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen. Roman 4. Nor shall take and use any such benefit or advantage of such permission, until such person be bound to the Chamberlain of London, in certain sums, for the keeping of good order, and avoiding of discords and inconveniences. V. Neither shall use or exercise such license or permission at any time, in which the same shall be by the Lord Mayor and aldermen restrained, or commanded to stay and cease, in any usual time of divine service on the Sunday or holiday, or receive any to that purpose in time of service to the same, upon pain to forfeit for every offence £5. Romans 6. And every person to be licensed shall, during the time of such continuance of licence, pay to the use of the poor in hospitals of the city, or of the poor visited with sickness, such sums and payments as between the mayor and aldermen and the person to be licensed shall be agreed upon pain that, on the want of every such payment, such licence shall be utterly void. Romans 7. All sums and forfeitures to be incurred for any offence against this act, and all forfeitures of bonds, shall be employed to the relief of the poor of the hospitals, or of the poor infected or diseased in the city, and the chamberlain in his own name shall have and recover the same, to the purposes aforesaid, in the court of the outer chamber of Guildhall, London, called the Mayor's Court. Provided that this act shall not extend to plays showed in private houses, lodgings of a nobleman, citizen, or gentleman, which shall have the same then played in his presence for the festivity of any marriage, assembly of friends, or other like cause, without public or common collection of money of the auditors or beholders. Maitland, Vol. IPP. 262-263. Since the players could act no more in the city, there was nothing for them but to go outside. In 1574, James Burbage and some of the Earl of Leicester's company obtained the Queen's licence to act plays in any part of England. After receiving this licence, Burbage proceeded to build the first theatre, the house called 346 simply, the theatre. This theatre was built outside the jurisdiction of the city, close to the remains of the Holywell Priory. After the dissolution, the church of this house was pulled down with most of the buildings. Houses were built upon its site, and the ruins themselves gradually disappeared. At the southwest of these ruins, on a site now marked by Dean's Mews, Holywell Lane, Burbage built his theatre at a cost of £600, the money being advanced by his father-in-law. The theatre was in shape either circular or oval, probably the former. It was built for all kind of shows and entertainments. If a large space was wanted, the whole of the area could be taken by the performers. Raised galleries ran round the house. For the performance of a play, a stage was erected in the middle. From the nature of the case, there could be no question of any scenery. The house was built of wood, and is said to have been handsomely decorated. The central area was without a roof. There were troubles and quarrels about the lease of the house, which was taken down in the year 1598-99. The wood and timber of which the house was built were removed to Bankside, where they were used for the erection of the Globe Theatre. The second theatre of London was that called the Curtain. It is a fact which illustrates the popularity of Finsbury Fields as a place of resort that there should have been a second theatre erected so close to the first. The Curtain Theatre was built on the south side of Holywell Lane, Shoreditch. In the house, too, feats of arms, sword play, quarterstaff, and other games took place. The third theatre, if we count the Globe as a continuation of the theatre, was the Fortune, built near Golden Lane, Cripplegate. The strongest charge against the theatres was the licence allowed to the clowns or jesters, who between the pieces or between the acts played jigs or drolls accompanied by songs and dances, and impromptu jokes which were topical, and, as may be imagined, broad and coarse. We may easily imagine that the civic authorities, the preachers, and the pamphleteers, who were always assailing the player and driving him from place to place, were not spared when the clown had the stage all to himself, with hundreds of grinning faces in front of him, all of whom were egging him on with laughter and applause to say or do something more outrageous still, and loved nothing so much as to see before them acted to the life some sour Puritan who could see only filthy and beastly stuff in the noblest play by Shakespeare, or in any sport. Bankside, Southwark, in 1648, with a view of Holland's Liga, one of the ancient stews or licensed brothels suppressed during the reign of Henry VIII. Another favourite place of resort for the citizens, especially for the more riotous sort, was Southwark, with its raised river wall or bankside, its numerous inns and taverns, its low-lying fields and its various amusements. There were amphitheatres for bear and bull baiting. In the High Street itself there was a ring for the bull. In Paris Gardens on the east side of Blackfriars Bridge were kept bears and dogs for the favourite, almost the national amusement. There 347 was a kind of sanctuary in Southwark. Here were allowed to reside the Flemish vrouws still in spite of Henry VII's suppression. Here were held May Day games. Here was held every pageant of St. George's Day. And here in the time of Henry VIII, were collected together idlers, vagabonds, and rogues in great numbers. In this place, the resort of all the young bloods and the wild element of London, the players settled down in force. The Rose, the Hope, the Globe, the Swan, all built about the same time, show the steady popularity of the drama, in spite of the puritanic attacks upon it, which seem to have done it no manner of harm. At one end of Bankside stood the ruins of the monastic house and the Clink prison, then followed a single row of houses, at the back of which were the bull-baiting ground and the bear garden, then the theatres already mentioned, also the Falcon Tavern and Paris Gardens. All these places were built on a low-lying and marshy ground planted thickly with trees, intersected with ponds, ditches and running streams. For instance, the Pudding Mill stream ran round 2/3 of Paris Gardens. For an account of the interior of a theatre and the presentation of a play, I quote an imaginary account, in my own words. The interior of the theatre was circular in shape. It contained 3 galleries, one above the other, the lowest called the rooms, for seats in which we paid a shilling each contained the better sorts. At each side of the stage there were boxes, one of which contained the music. The stage itself, a stout construction of timber, projected far into the pit, or as Stowe called it, the yard. At the back was another stage, supported on 2 columns, and giving the players a gallery about 10 or 12 feet high, the purpose of which we were very soon to find out. On each side of the stage were seats for those who paid an additional 6pence. Here were a dozen or 20 gallants, either with pipes of tobacco, or playing cards or dice before the play began. One of them would get up quickly with a pretence of impatience, and push back his cloak so as to show the richness of his doublet below. The young men, whether at the theatre, or in Paul's Walk, or in Cheap, seemed all intent upon showing the bravery of their attire. No girls of our day could be more vain of their dress or more critical of the dress worn by others. Some of them, however, I perceived among the groundlings, that is, the people on the yard, gazing about the house upon the women in the galleries. Here there were many dressed very finely, like ladies of quality, in satin gowns, lawn aprons, taffeta petticoats and gold threads in their hair. They seemed to rejoice in being thus observed and gazed upon. When a young man had found a girl to his taste, he went into the gallery, sat beside her and treated her to pippins, nuts or wine. It was already 1 o'clock when we arrived. As we took our seats the music played its first sounding or flourish. There was a great hubbub in the place. Hucksters went about with baskets crying pippins, nuts and ale. In the rooms 348 booksellers' boys hawked about new books. Everybody was talking together. Everywhere the people were smoking tobacco, playing cards, throwing dice, cheapening books, cracking nuts and calling for ale. The music played a second sounding. The hubbub continued unabated. Then it played the third and last. Suddenly the tumult ceased. The piece was about to begin. The stage was decorated with blue hangings of silk between the columns, showing that the piece was to be, in part at least, a comedy. Across the railed gallery at the back was stretched a painted canvas representing a royal palace. When the scene was changed, this canvas became the wall of a city, and the actors would walk on the top of the wall, or a street with houses, or a tavern with its red lattice and its red sign, or a tented field. When night was intended, the blue hangings were drawn up and exchanged for black. The hawkers retired and were quiet. The house settled down to listen, and the prologue began. Prologue appeared dressed in a long black velvet cloak. He assumed a diffident and most respectful manner. He bowed to the ground. In Troy there lies the scene, from isles of Greece. The princes Augulus, their high blood chafed, have to the port of Athens sent their ships. In this way the mind of the audience was prepared for what was to follow. We needed no playbill. The palace before us could be no other than Priam's palace. If there was a field with tents, it must be the battlefield and the camp of the Greeks. If there was a wall, it must be the wall of Troy. And though the scenery was rough, it was enough. One wants no more than the unmistakable suggestion. The poet and the actor find the rest. Therefore, though the intrusive gallants lay on the stage, though Troilus was dressed in the armour of Tudor time, and Pandrus wore just such a doublet as old Stowe himself, we were actually at Troy. The boy who played Cressida was a lovely maiden. The narrow stage was large enough for the council of kings, the wooing of lovers, and the battlefield of heroes. Women unfaithful and perjured, lovers trustful, warriors fierce, the alarms of war, fighting and slaying. The sweet whispers of love were drowned by the blare of trumpets. The loss of lover forgotten in the loss of a great captain. And among the warriors and the kings and the lovers, the creeping creatures who live upon the weaknesses and the sins of their betters played their parts. These narrow boards before a silent and enraptured house. For 3 hours we were kept out of our senses. There was no need, I say, of better scenery. A quick shifting of the canvas showed a battlefield, and turned the stage into a vast plain covered with armies of Greeks and Romans. Soldiers innumerable, as thick as motes in the sun, crossed the stage fighting, shouting, challenging each other. While they fought, the trumpets blew and the drums beat, the wounded fell, and the fight continued over these prostrate bodies till they were carried off by their 349 friends. The chiefs rushed to the front, crossed swords, and rushed off again. "Come both you cogging Greeks," said Troilus, while our cheeks flushed and our lips parted. If the stage had been 4 times as broad, if the number of men in action had been multiplied by 10, we could not have felt more vividly the rage, the joy, the madness of the battle. When the play was finished, the ale, the apples, and the nuts were passed round, and the noise began again. Then the clown came in and began to sing, and the music played, but oh, how poor it seemed after the great emotions of the play. The old man plucked me by the sleeve and we went out, and with us most of the better sort. London, pp. 237-239. In addition to the foregoing, or as confirming and supplementing that account, I quote the following from Drake's Shakespeare and His Times. The passion for the stage continued rapidly to increase, and before the year 1590, not less than 4 or 5 theatres were in existence. The patronage of dramatic representation made an equal progress at court, for though Elizabeth never, it is believed, attended a public theatre, yet had she 4 companies of children who frequently performed for her amusement, denominated the Children of St. Paul's, the Children of Westminster, the Children of the Chapel, and the Children of Windsor. The public actors, too, who were sometimes, in imitation of these appellations, called the Children of the Revels, were, towards the close of Her Majesty's reign especially, in consequence of a greatly acquired superiority over their younger brethren, often called upon to act before her at the Royal Theatre in Whitehall. Exhibitions of this kind at court were usual at Christmas, on Twelfth Night, at Candlemas, and at Shrovetide, throughout the reigns of Elizabeth and James, and the plays of Shakespeare were occasionally the entertainment of the night. Thus we find Love's Labour Lost to have been performed before our maiden queen during the Christmas holidays, and King Lear to have been exhibited before King James on St. Stephen's Night. On these occasions the representation was generally at night, that it might not interfere with the performances at the regular theatre, which took place early in the afternoon. And we learn from the council books that the royal remuneration in the age of Elizabeth, for the exhibition of a single play at Whitehall, amounted to £10, of which 20 nobles, or £6 13 shillings and 4pence, formed the customary fee, and £3 6 shillings and 8pence the free gift or bounty. If, however, the performers were required to leave the capital for any of the royal palaces in its neighbourhood, the fee, in consequence of the public exhibition of the day being prevented, was augmented to £20. The protection of the drama by Elizabeth and her ministers, though it did not exempt the public players, except in one instance, from the penalties of statutes against vagabonds, yet it induced during the whole of her long reign numerous instances of private patronage from the most opulent of her nobility and gentry 350 who, possessing the power of licensing their domestics as comedians and consequently of protecting them from the operation of the Act of Vagrancy, sheltered various companies of performers under the denomination of their servants or retainers, a privilege which was taken away by Act of Parliament on the accession of James, and, as Mr. Chalmers observes, put an end for ever to the scenic system of prior times. There were no fewer than 14 companies of players, under private patronage, who contributed to exhilarate the people of London and the country. Of these, Drake furnishes a chronological enumeration. Soon after the accession of Elizabeth appeared Lord Leicester's company, the same which in 1574 was finally incorporated by royal licence. In 1572 was formed Sir Robert Lane's company. In the same year Lord Clinton's. In 1575 companies were created by Lord Warwick and the Lord Chamberlain, the name of Shakespeare being enrolled among the servants of the latter, who, in the first year of the subsequent reign, became entitled to the appellation of His Majesty's servants. In 1576, the Earl of Sussex brought forward a theatrical body, and in 1577 Lord Howard another, neither of which, however, attained much eminence. In 1578 the Earl of Essex mustered a company of players, and in 1579 Lord Strange and the Earl of Derby followed his example. In 1591 the Lord Admiral produced his set of comedians. In 1592 the Earl of Hertford effected a similar arrangement. In 1593 Lord Pembroke protected an association of actors, and at the close of Her Majesty's reign the Earl of Worcester had in pay also a company of theatrical performers. As regards the management of his property in the play, the author had the choice of 2 methods. He might sell the copyright to the theatre. In this case, to which authors frequently had recourse in the age of Shakespeare, the dramatist sold outright the whole rights of the piece, so that the proprietors of the theatre secured its performance exclusively to their own company. If it was a popular piece, of course, they were not anxious to publish it. If, however, the author kept the piece in his own hands, he not only had the right of publication, but he had likewise a claim upon the theatre for a benefit. This, towards the termination of the 16th century, took place on the second day, and was soon afterwards, as early indeed as 1612, postponed to the third day. The price of a drama, when disposed of to the public players, was 20 nobles, or £6, 13 shillings and 4pence, but private companies would sometimes give more than that sum. The price of a play when published was 6pence, and the poet received about 40 shillings of an honorarium for a dedication. It has been stated, however, that Shakespeare received but £5 for his Hamlet. St. Mary Spittal, Houndstitch, Crutched Friars, Priory of Holy Trinity, Aldgate, St. Bartolph Aldgate, the Minories, the Postern Gate, Great Tower Hill, Place of Execution, All Hallows Church Barking, the Custom House, Tower of London, the White Tower, Traitor's Gate, Little Tower Hill, East Smithfield, Stepney, St. Catherine's Church, St. Catherine's Dock, St. Catherine's Hospital, Isle of Dogs, Monastery of Bermondsey, Says Court Diptford, Palace of Placentia, Greenwich. From the Panorama of London, Westminster and Southwark in 1543, by Anthony van den Wingerd, Sutherland Collection, Bodleian Library, Oxford, for continuation CPP 218 and 235. Hentzner, the German traveller, thus speaks of the theatres. Without the city are some theatres, where English actors represent almost 351 everyday comedies and tragedies to very numerous audiences. These are concluded with variety of dances, accompanied by excellent music, and the excessive applause of those that are present. Not far from one of these theatres, which are all built of wood, lies the Royal Barge, close to the River Thames. It has 2 splendid cabins, beautifully ornamented with glass windows, painting and carving. It is kept upon dry ground and sheltered from the weather. The entertainment offered to the French ambassador at the court of Henry VIII at Greenwich shows that acting and dressing formed part of a courtly entertainment. They began with tournaments and contests on foot and horse. They went on to an interlude in Latin, the altars being all richly dressed. This being ended, says the author of the Life of Wolsey, there came a great company of ladies and gentlemen, the chiefest beauties in the realm of England, being as richly attired as cost could make or art devise, to set forth their gestures, proportions, or beauties, that they seemed to the beholder rather like celestial angels than terrestrial creatures, and in my judgment worthy of admiration, with whom the gentlemen of France danced and masked, every man choosing his lady as his fancy served. That done, and the maskers departed, came in another mask of ladies and gentlewomen, so richly attired as I cannot express. These ladies maskers took each of them one of the Frenchmen to dance, and here note that these noblewomen spoke all of them good French, which delighted them much to hear the ladies speak to them in their own language. Thus triumphantly did they spend the whole night from 5 of the clock at the night into 2 or 3 of the clock in the morning, at which time the gallants drew all to their lodgings to take their rest. There was a kind of show called a prolusion. This appears to have been a representation of some well-known event or legend. Thus in 1587 there was a prolusion set forth by Hugh Awfley, merchant adventurer and leather seller, one of the sheriffs of the year 1588. It represented King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. He chose 300 good archers, personable men, and he dressed them in black satin doublets and black velvet hose. Every man carried a bow of yew and a dozen waxed arrows. They marched in goodly array from Merchant Taylor's to Mile End Green. Queen Elizabeth in her chariot passed them, and stopped in order to see the show. In her whole life, she said, she had never seen a finer company of archers. They all fell on their knees and prayed God to prosper and preserve her majesty. She thanked them and passed on her way, while the archers proceeded to attack the sham forts which had been set up, after which those who shot best took prizes, and Master Hugh Awfley provided a banquet for all. It is interesting to remember that the theatre had to contend for the place of honour with the stately and courtly mask. All that artist could do for decoration, 352 or stage manager could devise for machinery, or that poet could imagine or invent for fable, was pressed into the service of the masque. The dresses the players wore were most gorgeous, the speeches were fine, the dances and the songs were most beautiful. Real mountains contained real caves, dryads ran out of the woods, naiads lay beside running streams, all the guards and goddesses of Ovid took part in the action. There were thrones of gold and silver, there were star-spangled skies, sea gods and river gods appeared, tritons blew their shells, mermaids swam about the seashell of mother of pearl in which sat Venus herself, and all this time the theatre itself had no scenery and no stage management and no machinery. The masque, however, did not assume its full development till the next century. It will be found more fully treated in the chapter on the theatre and art in London in the time of the Stuarts. Even more popular than the theatre were the sports of bear-baiting, bull-baiting, wrestling, quarterstaff and single-stick. The favourite place for these sports was the Paris garden beyond Bankside. Yet every Sunday they will surely spend one penny or two, the bearwards living to Mendy, at Paris garden each Sunday. A man shall not fail to find 200 or 300 for the bearwards vale, one halfpenny apiece they use for to give, when some have no more in their purse. I believe you shall read contemporary accounts of bear-baiting and bull-baiting. Some, says John Houghton in 1694, keep the bull on purpose for the sport of baiting, cutting off the tips of his horns, and with pitch, tow, and such like matter, fasten upon them the great horns of oxen with their tips cut off, and covered with leather, lest they should hurt the dogs. Because these papers go into several other countries, I'll say something of the manner of baiting the bull, which is by having a collar about his neck, fastened to a thick rope about 3, 4, or 5 yards long, hung to a hook, so fastened to a stake that it will turn round. With this the bull circulates to watch his enemy, which is a mastiff dog, commonly used to the sport, with a short nose, that his teeth may take the better hold. This dog, if right, will creep upon his belly, that he may, if possible, get the bull by the nose, which the bull as carefully strives to defend, by laying it close to the ground, where his horns are also ready to do what in them lies to toss the dog. And this is the true sport. But if more dogs than one come at once, if they are cowardly and come under his legs, he will, if he can, stamp their guts out. I believe I have seen a dog tossed by a bull 30, if not 40 foot high, and when they are tossed either higher or 353 lower, the men above strive to catch them on their shoulders, lest the fall might mischief the dogs. They commonly lay sand about, that if they fall upon the ground it may be the easier. Notwithstanding this care, a great many dogs are killed, more have their limbs broke, and some hold so fast that by the bull's swinging them their teeth are often broke out. To perfect the history of bull-baiting, I must tell you that the famed dogs have crosses or roses of various coloured ribbon stuck with pitch on their foreheads, and such like the ladies are very ready to bestow on dogs or bull that do valiantly. And when tea's stuck on the bull's forehead, that dog is hollowed that fetches it off, though the true courage and art is to hold the bull by the nose, till he roars, which a courageous bull scorns to do. Often the men are tossed as well as the dogs, and men, bull and dogs, seem exceedingly pleased, and as earnest at the sport as if it were for the lives or livelihoods. Many great wagers are laid on both sides, and great journeys will men and dogs go for such a diversion. I knew a gentleman that bought a bull in Hertfordshire on purpose to go a progress with him, at a great charge, into most of the great towns in the west of England. This is a sport the English much delight in, and not only the baser sort but the greatest lords and ladies. And here is Laneham on the sport of bear-baiting. It was a sport very pleasant of these beasts, to see the bear with his pink eyes leering after his enemies approach, the nimbleness and weight of the dog to take his advantage, and the force and experience of the bear agging to avoid the assaults. If he were bitten in one place, who he would pinch in an other to get free, that if he were taken once, then what shift with biting, with clawing, with roaring, tossing and tumbling he would walk to wind himself from them. And when he was loose, to shake his ears twice or thrice with the blood and slour about his physiognomy, was a matter of a goodly relief. We have already heard Hentzner on theatres, he has a word to say also on baiting. There is still another place, built in the form of a theatre, which serves for the baiting of bulls and bears. They are fastened behind, and then worried by those great English dogs and mastiffs, but not without great risk to the dogs from the teeth of the one and the horns of the other, and it sometimes happens they are killed on the spot. fresh ones are immediately supplied in the places of those that are wounded or tired. To this entertainment often follows that of whipping a blinded bear, which is performed by 5 or 6 men, standing in a circle with whips which they exercise upon him without any mercy. Although he cannot escape from them because of his chain, he nevertheless defends himself vigorously, throwing down all who come 354 within his reach and are not active enough to get out of it, tearing the whips out of their hands and breaking them. At these spectacles and everywhere else, the English are constantly seen smoking the nicotian weed, which in America is called tobacco, and generally in this manner. They have pipes on purpose made of clay, into the farther end of which they put the herb, so dry that it may be rubbed into powder, and lighting it they draw the smoke into their mouths, which they puff out again through their nostrils, along with plenty of phlegm and defluxion from the head. In these theatres, fruits, such as apples, pears, and nuts according to the season, are carried about to be sold, as well as wine and ale. But besides these cruel forms of so-called sport, there were more legitimate pleasures such as archery. During the holy days in summer, Fitzstephen says, the young men exercised themselves in the sports of leaping, archery, etc. The practice of archery was maintained in the city after the longbow had to give way before gun and cannon. As a pastime of the citizens only, no account of London would be complete without reference to archery. There were, as everyone knows, 2 kinds of bow, the longbow and the crossbow. The former, for various reasons, its superiority in readiness of handling, lightness in carrying, range of flight and sureness of aim, caused it to be much more generally adopted in our armies than its rival. At Crécy, for instance, our men were armed with longbows, and the French with crossbows. When the rain fell, the longbows could be easily covered up, the crossbow could not, so that the strings were wetted and the power of the weapon greatly injured. Edward I, who had a great opinion of the longbow as the superior weapon, ordered, on the threat of war with France, every sheriff of a county to provide 500 white bows and as many bundles of arrows. Edward III issued repeated proclamations ordering the practice of archery. It would seem as if the word archery in the 14th century included the crossbow as well as the longbow, for Edward II, in 1314, Riley, Memorials, p. 124, commanded the city of London to furnish 300 arbalisters more powerful for defence, and to provide them with hacketons, bassinets, collarets, arbalists, and querels. The hacketon was a jacket of quilted leather, the bassinet was a headpiece, the collaret an iron collar for the protection of the throat, the arbalist is the crossbow, the querel was the bolt. Richard II ordered that every man in his household should exercise himself, as occasion should permit, in archery, and in 1392 an act was passed obliging all servants to practice archery on holidays. In 1417 Henry VII ascribed his victory at Agincourt chiefly to his archers, and orders the sheriffs of the counties to pluck from every goose 6 wing feathers for the improvement of the arrow. These feathers were the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th of each wing. Edward Roman IV ordered that Englishmen in Ireland and every Irishman living with Englishmen 355 should be provided with a bow of his own height, which was to be made of yew, wych, hazel, ash, or alder. Butts were to be erected in every township, and the inhabitants were to practice on every feast day. The same king sent 1,000 archers to the Duke of Burgundy, who was to pay them 6d a day, about 5 shillings of our money. Nothing can prove more conclusively the estimation in which archers were held. The same king provided for his war both guns and bows. A great deal of yew was imported at this time. It came in the Venetian ships from Dalmatia and the countries on the eastern shores of the Adriatic. In the 19th year of Henry VII, the king finally decided for the longbow against the crossbow, because the longbow had been much used in this realm, whereby honour and victory had been got against outward enemies, the realm greatly defended, and much more the dread of all Christian princes by reason of the same. Henry VII himself shot at the butts. There were at least 5 statutes issued by Henry VIII, ordering the practice of archery but forbidding the crossbow. The London archers continued to hold their yearly contests in the month of September, in spite of the fact that henceforth there would be no use for the longbow in warfare. They formed a very fine corps, had they been of any use. Meantime, the city has always loved a show, and a very fine show the archers provided. Their captain was called the Duke of Shoreditch. The captains of the different companies were called the Marquesses of Clerkenwell, Islington, Hoxton, and the Earl of Pancras, 13, etc. In the year 1583, they assembled at Merchant Taylor's Hall to the number of 3,000, all sumptuously apparelled, 942 having chains of gold about their necks. They were escorted by whifflers and bowmen to the number of 4,000, besides pages and footmen, and so marching through Broad Street, where the Duke of Shoreditch lived, they proceeded by Moorfields and Finsbury to Smithfield, where, after performing their evolutions, they shot at the target for glory. The Finsbury archers continued to exist and to hold their meetings till well into the 18th century. Mr. Daines Barrington, writing for the Society of Antiquaries in 1787, mentions that there were still living 2 old men who had obtained prizes in these contests as late as 1753, when they ceased. The same writer gives a map of the butts or archers, marks in Finsbury Fields, as they were standing in the year 1787. The distance between the marks varies from 120 feet to 300 feet. It may be assumed that 200 feet was a fairly average distance for an arrow. The proper weight for an arrow was considered to be 1 ounce only. It was to be winged by 3 feathers, 2 white being plucked from the gander, and 356, 1 grey taken from the goose. This difference in colour showed the archer when the arrow was properly placed. The Artillery Company or Finsbury Archers, predecessors of the present Artillery Company, enjoyed certain privileges as to dress, as to shooting at birds, and immunity from the charge of murder should anyone be killed by these arrows, especially after they had cried "fast" as a warning. It appears that bows and arrows were employed long after they left the field of battle for shooting rabbits and crows, partly because gunpowder was dear, but chiefly because the arrow makes no noise to frighten the game away. The London archers continued, in spite of the fact that henceforth there would be no use of the longbow in warfare, to hold their yearly contests in the month of September. The Honourable Artillery Company, before it received its letters patent, had been in the habit of practising archery in the fields of Islington, Hoxton and Shoreditch. In these fields targets or butts were fixed to shoot at. 2 of these butts or targets were still in existence in 1860, one at the end of Dorchester Street, Hoxton, on the east side of the New North Road near the Canal Bridge, and the other in the brickwork of the Canal Bridge above the towing path. 2 others had been destroyed about the year 1845, one in the Britannia Fields and the other in the ground now called Wellington Square. That standing at the end of Dorchester Road was called Whitehall. A drawing of it is given in the L&M Arch, Society Vol. Roman II, p. 15. The other sports, feasts and festivals of the city remained in the 16th century much as they had been before the change of faith, with certain exceptions, such as the Boy Bishop, the Feast of All Fools in the church, and the Miracle Play with its profanity and coarseness. These vanished. There remained the feasts of Christmas and Easter, the celebration of May Day, the vigils of St. John, St. Peter and St. Paul, and the Midsummer Watch. There were also Shrove Tuesday, Hawking Day, Whitsuntide and Martinmas, with some others. The ceremonies of a Christmas banquet are preserved in Gerard Lee's Accidents of Armoury, and have been reproduced by Nichols. The feast was that of the year 1561. The place was the Temple. The person called Palaphilos was the Constable and Marshal Dudley, Earl of Leicester. The next day I thought for my pastime to walk to this temple, and entering in at the gates I found the building nothing costly, but many comely gentlemen of face and person, and thereto very courteous, so I passed to and fro, so as it seemed a prince's port to be at hand, and passing forward entered into a church of antient building, wherein were many monuments of noble personages armed in knightly habit, with their coats depainted in ancient shields, whereat I took pleasure to behold. Thus gazing as one bereft with the rare sight, there came unto me an Herot, by name Palaphilos, a king of arms, who courteously saluted me, saying, for that I was a stranger, and seeming by my demeanour a lover of honour, I was his guest of right, whose courtesy, as reason was, I obeyed, answering I was at his commandment. Then, said he, ye shall go to mine own lodging here within the palace, where we 357 will have such cheer as the time and country will yield us, where, I assure you, I was so entertained as no where I met with better cheer or company, etc. Thus talking we entered the prince's hall, where anon we heard the noise of drum and fife. What meaneth this drum? Said I. Quoth he, this is to warn gentlemen of the household to repair to the dresser. Wherefore come on with me, and ye shall stand where ye may best see the hall served. And so from thence brought me into a long gallery that stretched itself along the hall near the prince's table, where I saw the prince set. A man of tall personage, a manly countenance, somewhat brown of visage, strongly featured, and thereto comely proportioned in all lineaments of body. At the nether end of the same table were placed the embassadors of sundry princes. Before him stood the carver, sewer and cupbearer, with great number of gentlemen waiters attending his person, the ushers making place to strangers of sundry regions that came to behold the honour of this mighty captain. After the placing of these honourable guests, the Lord Steward, Treasurer and Keeper of Palace Seal, with divers honourable personages of that nobility, were placed at a side table near adjoining the prince on the right hand, and at another table on the left side were placed the treasurer of the household, secretary, the prince his serjeant at the law, 4 masters of the revels, the king of arms, the dean of the chapel, and divers gentlemen pensioners to furnish the same. At another table on the other side were set the master of the game, and his chief ranger, masters of household, clerks of the green cloth and check, with divers other strangers to furnish the same. On the other side against them began the table the lieutenant of the tower, accompanied with divers captains of footbands and shot. At the nether end of the hall began the table, the high butler, the panter, clerks of the kitchen, master cook of the privy kitchen, furnished throughout with the soldiers and guard of the prince, all which with number of inferior officers placed and served in the hall, besides the great resort of strangers I spare to write. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, 1532, minus 1588. From the painting by Zuccaro in the National Portrait Gallery, London. The prince so served with tender meats, sweet fruits and dainty delicates confectioned with curious cookery, as it seemed wonder a world to observe the provision, and at every course the trumpeters blew the courageous blast of deadly war, with noise of drum and fife, with the sweet harmony of violins, sackbuts, recorders and cornets, with other instruments of music, as it seemed Apollo's harp had turned their stroke. Thus the whole was served after the most ancient order of the island. In commendation whereof I say, I have also seen the service of great princes, in solemn seasons and times of triumph, yet the order hereof was not inferior to any. But to proceed, this Herod Palaphilos, even before the second course came in, standing at the high table, said in this manner: The mighty Palaphilos, Prince of Sophie, High Constable Marshal of the Knights Templars, patron of the Honourable Order of Pegasus, and therewith crieth a largess. The prince, praising the Herod, bountifully rewarded him with a chain to the value of 100 talents. I assure you I languish for want of cunning, ripely to utter that I saw so orderly handled a pertaining to service, wherefore I cease and return to my purpose. The supper ended and tables taken up, the high constable rose and a while stood under the place of honour, where his achievement was beautifully embroidered and devised of sundry matters, with the ambassadors of foreign nations, as he thought good, till Palaphilos, king of arms, came in, his Herod marshal and pursuivant before him, and after followed his messenger and caligate knight, who putting off his coronal made his humble obeisance to the prince, by whom he was commanded to draw near and understand his pleasure, saying to him in few words to this effect: Palaphilos, seeing it hath pleased the high palace to think me to demerit the office of this place, and thereto this night past vouchsafe to descend from heavens to increase my further honour, by creating me knight of her order of Pegasus, as also commanded me to join in the same society such valiant gentlemen throughout her province whose living honour hath best deserved the same, the choice whereof most aptly belongeth to your skill, being the watchman of their doings and register of their deserts. I will ye choose as well throughout our whole armies as elsewhere, of such special gentlemen as the guards hath appointed, the number of 24, and the names of them present us, commanding also those chosen persons to appear in our presence in knightly habit, that with conveniency we may proceed in our purpose. This done, Palaphilos, obeying his prince's commandment, with 24 knights, all apparelled in long white vestures, with each man a scarf of palace colours, and them presented with their names to the prince, who allowed well his choice and commanded him to do his office, who, after his duty to the prince, bowed towards these worthy personages, standing every man to his ante, as he had borne arms in the field, and began to show his prince's pleasure, with the honour of the order. And here is a note from Stowe on Christmas customs. Against the feast of Christmas, every man's house, as also their parish churches, were decked with home, ivy, bays, and whatsoever the season of the year afforded to be green. The conduits and standards in the streets were likewise garnished, amongst the which I read that in the year 1444, by tempest of thunder and lightning, on the 1st of February at night, Paul's steeple was fired, but with great labour quenched, and toward the morning of Candlemas Day at the Leaden Hall in Cornhill, a standard of tree, being set up in the midst of the pavement fast in the ground, nailed full of home and ivy, for disport of Christmas to the people, was torn up and cast down by the malignant spirit as was thought. And the stones of the pavement all about were cast in the streets, and into divers houses, so that the people were war aghast at the great tempests. Let us pass on to the great festival of May Day. Forth goeth all the court both most and lest, to fetch the flowers fresh, and branch and bloom, and namely Hawthorn brought both page and groom, and then rejoicen in their great delight. eke etch at other throw the flowers bright, the primrose, the violet, and the gold, with fresh garlands party blue and white. Philip Stubbs says, against May Whitsunday or some other time of the year, every parish, town, and village assemble themselves together, both men, women, and children, and either going all together or dividing themselves into companies, they go some to the woods and groves, some to the hills and mountains, some to one place, some to another, where they spend all the night in pleasant pastimes, and in the morning they return bringing with them birch, boughs, and branches of trees to deck their assemblies withal. But their chiefest jewel they bring from thence is their May pool, which they bring home with great veneration, as thus: they have 20 or 40 yoke of oxen, every ox having a sweet nosegay of flowers tied on the tip of his horns, and these oxen draw home the May pool, this stinking idol rather, which is covered all over with flowers and herbs, bound round about with strings from the top to the bottom, and sometime painted with variable colours, with 200 or 300 men, women, and children following it with great devotion, and thus being reared up with handkerchiefs and flags streaming on the top, they straw the ground about, bind green boughs about it, set up summer hollers, bowers, and arbours hard by it, and then fall they to banquet and feast, to leap and dance about it, as the heathen people did at the dedication of their idols. I have heard it credibly reported, he sarcastically adds, by men of great gravity, credit, and reputation, that of 40, 60 or 100 maids going to the wood overnight, there have scarcely the third part of them returned home again as they went. The Anatomy of Abuses, 1836 edition, p. 171. Herrick says, get up and see the dew bespangling herb and tree. Each flower has wept and bowed toward the east. Above an hour since, it is sin, nay profanation to keep in, when as 1,000 virgins on this day spring sooner than the larks to fetch in May. Come, my coroner, come, and calming mark how each field turns a street, each street a park, made green and trimmed with trees. See how devotion gives each house a bough or branch, each porch, each door. Ere this an ark or tabernacle is, made up of white thorn neatly interwove, as if here were those cooler shades of love. Can such delights be in the street, and open fields, and we not seat? Come, we'll abroad, and let's obey the proclamation made for May, and sin no more as we have done by staying. There's not a budding boy or girl this day but is got up and gone to bring in May. A deal of youth ere this is come back, and with white thorn laden home. Some have dispatched their cakes and cream before that we have left to dream, and some have wept and wooed and plighted troth, and chose their priest ere we can cast off sloth. Many a green gown has been given, many a kiss both odd and even, many a glance too has been sent from out the eye love's firmament, many a jest told of the keys betraying. This night and larks picked, ye were not a-maying of the festive appearance of the streets in summer, and the hospitality of the citizens, and the setting of the midsummer watch. Stowe speaks at length. Toms's edition, p. 39. In the months of June and July, on the vigils of festival days, and on the same festival days in the evenings after the sun setting, there were usually made bonfires in the streets, every man bestowing wood or labour towards them. The wealthier sort also, before their doors, near to the said bonfires, would set out tables on the vigils, furnished with sweet bread and good drink, and on the festival days with meats and drinks plentifully, whereunto they would invite their neighbours and passengers also to sit and be merry with them in great familiarity, praising God for his benefits bestowed on them. These were called bonfires, as well of good amity amongst neighbours that being before at controversy were there, by the labour of others, reconciled and made of bitter enemies loving friends, and also for the virtue that a great fire hath to purge the infection of the air. On the vigil of St. John the Baptist, and on St. Peter and Paul the Apostles, every man's door being shadowed with green birch, long fennel, St. John's wort, orpin, white lilies, and such like, garnished upon with garlands of beautiful flowers, had also lamps of glass with oil burning in them all the night. Some hung out branches of iron curiously wrought, containing hundreds of lamps alight at once, which made a goodly show, namely in New Fish Street, Thames Street, etc. 361, drawn by Grignon, photographed by Dr. Diamond J. Hale Cour SR. A Fate at Horselydown in 159. From a picture by G. Hofnagel at Hatfield House. At Whitsuntide 1900 I was at Treves. It is the custom on Whit Sunday to hold a great procession in which, apparently, the whole population takes part through the principal streets to the cathedral. The girls are dressed in white with white flowers in their hair. The younger girls carry baskets filled with white flowers. Men, women and children are all chanting as they go. Groups of priests, boys in scarlet, beadles and other ecclesiastical selections adorn the procession. If that were all I should not notice it in this place. But in addition, every street through which the procession passed was decorated with branches. And here for the first time I understood the lines already quoted, how each field turns a street, each street a park, made green and trimmed with trees. See how devotion gives each house a bough, or branch, each porch, each door. Ere this, an ark or tabernacle is made up of white thorn neatly interwove. For the decking of the house did not consist of a branch or a bunch over a porch or a window, but the whole ground floor of every house was covered with great boughs closely placed side by side, so as to look like a lane of trees. Herrick did not exaggerate. Stowe goes on to speak of the marching watch. Besides the standing watches all in bright harness, in every ward and street in this city and suburbs, there was also a marching watch that passed through the principal streets thereof, to wit, from the little conduit by Paul's Gate to West Cheap, by the Stocks through Cornhill, by Leaden Hall to Aldgate, then back down Fenchurch Street, by Grass Church about Grass Church Conduit, and up Grass Church Street into Cornhill, and through it into West Cheap again, and so broke up. The whole way ordered for this marching watch extendeth to 3,200 tailors' yards of a size. For the furniture whereof with lights, there were appointed 700 cressets, 500 of them being found by the companies, the other 200 by the Chamber of London. Besides the which lights every constable in London, in number more than 240, had his cresset. The charge of every cresset was in light 2 shillings and 4pence, and every cresset had 2 men, one to bear or hold it, another to bear a bag with light, and to serve it, so that the poor men, pertaining to the cressets, taking wages, besides that every one had a strawn hat with a badge painted, and his breakfast, amounted in number to almost 2,000. The marching watch contained in number about 2,000 men, part of them being old soldiers, of skill to be captains, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, etc., whifflers, drummers and fifes, standard and ensign bearers, demolances on great horses, gunners with hand guns or half-hakes, archers in coats of white fustian, signed on the breast and back with the arms of the city, their bows bent in their hands with sheafs of arrows by their sides, pikemen in bright corslets, burgonets, etc., halbards, the like the billmen in almain rivets and aprons of mail in great number. There were also divers pageants, morris dancers, constables the one half, which was 120 on St. John's Eve, the other half on St. Peter's Eve in bright harness, some over gilt, and every one adorned of scarlet thereupon, and a chain of gold, his henchmen following him, his minstrels before him, and his cresset light passing by him, the waits of the city, the mayor's officers for his guard before him, all in a livery of worsted or sea jackets party-coloured, the mayor himself well mounted on horseback, the sword-bearer before him in fair armour well mounted also, the mayor's footmen and the like torch-bearers, about him henchmen twain upon great stirring horses following him. The sheriffs' watches came one after the other in like order, but not so large in number as the mayor's, for where the mayor had besides his giant 3 pageants, each of the sheriffs had besides their giants but 2 pageants, each their morris dance and 1 henchman, their officers in jackets of worsted or sea, party-coloured, differing from the mayor's and each from other, but having harnessed men a great many. This midsummer watch was thus accustomed yearly, time out of mind, until the year 1539, the 31st of Henry VIII, in which year on the 8th of May, a great muster was made by the citizens at the Mile's End, all in bright harness, with coats of white silk or cloth and chains of gold, in 3 great battles, to the number of 15,000, which passed through London to Westminster, and so through the sanctuary, and round about the park of St. James, and returned home through Oldbourne. King Henry, then considering the great charges of the citizens for the furniture of this unusual muster, forbade the marching watch provided for at midsummer for that year, which being once laid down, was not raised again till the year 1548, the 2nd of Edward Roman VI. Sir John Gresham then being mayor, who caused the marching watch, both on the eve of St. John Baptist and of St. Peter the Apostle, to be revived and set forth in as comely order as it hath been accustomed, which watch was also beautified by the number of more than 300 demolances and light horsemen, prepared by the citizens to be sent into Scotland for the rescue of the town of Haddington, and others kept by the Englishmen. Stow vol. I. As for dancing, never was there a time when it was more popular. Everybody danced. The Queen at Whitehall danced the brawl, the kitchen maid in the street danced the neigh. They danced the solemn pavane, the cassames o' galliard, the canary dance, the coranto, the cavolta, the jig, the galliard, the fancy and the neigh, and perhaps many more. They played cards. They played at primero, trump, gleek, gresso, new cut, knave out of doors, rough, noddy, most and pace. They got through the long winter evenings mainly with the help of cards. Bowling was a summer amusement. Tournaments belonged to the court. Hunting was an amusement for the richer sort. The people also fought cocks, wrestled, practiced archery and played quarterstaff. The old 364 Catholic feasts and sports, such as the Feast of Fools, the Boy Bishop, the mysteries in the churches were abolished. But in their own houses they had mumming and mummers. For the ladies there was embroidery. There was also fine work of all kinds, and there was a great demand for monsters. A pig with 8 legs, strange fishes caught in the river, a mermaid quite fresh, unfortunately dead, caught off the Yarmouth roads, a calf with 2 backs, a lobster with 6 claws. These things were always on exhibition for the most part in Fleet Street. Their Morris dances, their maypoles, wits and ales, their fairs and wakes, and in fact every occasion for meeting together, singing, feasting and dancing, this Protestant city kept up. The Dancing Picture by Holbein and Janet, in the possession of Major General F. E. Sotheby. Among the amusements of the people must not be forgot the common custom of telling stories. The long evenings when the family gathered round 365 the fire, the only light in the room, were tedious. They could hardly go to bed much before 8, though they rose long before daybreak. Storytelling was an amusement which had long ago pleased the Saxons and the Danes, who recounted the great deeds of their ancestors to while away the winter evening. Perhaps many of the stories which found their way into books during the 16th century served this purpose, while the merry jests of Scogan and Peel, and the rest, certainly formed part of the storyteller's repertoire. Another amusement was that of reading. We have already seen what an immense field was opened up for those who loved books, by the shoals which during Elizabeth's reign were issued from the press. The first lottery was set on foot in the year 1559. The drawing took place at the west door of St. Paul's, and continued daily from the 11th of January to the 6th of May following. The lottery did not gain its full power until the 18th century. It is sufficient here to record the first appearance of this baleful institution, fruitful mother of crime. Chapter 8. The poor. Harrison says that there are 4 kinds of poor: the poor by impotence, as the fatherless child, the blind man, and the incurably sick man; the poor by casualty, as the wounded soldier; the thriftless poor, as the rioter that hath consumed all; the vagabond that will abide nowhere; and finally, the rogues and strumpet, which are not possible to be divided in sunder. As regards the last sort, Harrison's description tells everything that is wanted. Such as are idle beggars through their own default are of 2 sorts, and continue their estates either by casual or mere voluntary means. Those that are such by casual means are in the beginning justly to be referred either to the first or second sort of poor aforementioned, but degenerating into the thriftless sort, they do what they can to continue their misery, and with such impediments as they have to stray and wander about, as creatures abhorring all labour and every honest exercise. Certes I call these casual means, not in respect of the original of their poverty, but of the continuance of the same, from whence they will not be delivered. Such is their own ungracious lewdness and froward disposition. The voluntary means proceed from outward causes, as by making of corrosives, and applying the same to the more fleshy parts of their bodies, and also laying of ratsbane, sparewort, crowfoot, and such like unto their whole members, thereby to raise pitiful and odious sores, and move the hearts of the goers by such places where they lie, to yearn at their misery and bestow large almess upon them. How artificially they beg, what forcible speech, and how they select and choose out words of vehemency, whereby they do in manner conjure or adjure the goer by to pity their cases, I pass over to remember, as judging the name of God and Christ to be more conversant in the mouths of none, and yet the presence of the heavenly majesty further off from no men than from this ungracious company, which maketh me to think that punishment is far meeter for them than liberality or almess, and sith Christ willeth us chiefly to have a regard to himself and his poor members. Unto this nest is another sort to be referred, more sturdy than the rest, which having sound and perfect limbs do yet, notwithstanding, sometime counterfeit the possession of all sorts of diseases. Divers times in their apparel also they will be like serving men or labourers, Oftentimes they can play the mariners, and seek for ships which they never lost. But in fine, they are thieves and caterpillars in the commonwealth, and by the word of God not permitted to eat, sith they do but lick the sweat from the true labourers' brows, and bereave the godly poor of that which is due unto them, to maintain their excess, consuming the charity of well-disposed people bestowed upon them, after a most wicked and detestable manner. It is not yet full 80 years since this trade began, but how it hath prospered since that time, it is easy to judge, for they are now supposed of one sex and another to amount unto about 10,000 persons, as I have heard reported. Moreover, in counterfeiting the Egyptian rogues, they have devised a language among themselves, which they name canting, but other pedlars French, a speech compact 30 years since of English, and a great number of odd words of their own devising, without all order or reason, and yet such is it as none but themselves are able to understand. The first deviser thereof was hanged by the neck, a just reward no doubt for his deserts, and a common end to all of that profession. The punishment that is ordained for this kind of people is very sharp, and yet it cannot restrain them from their gadding, wherefore the end must needs be martial law, to be exercised upon them, as upon thieves, robbers, despisers of all laws, and enemies to the commonwealth and welfare of the land. What notable robberies, pilferings, murders, rapes, and stealings of young children, burning, breaking, and disfiguring their limbs to make them pitiful in the sight of the people, I need not to rehearse, but for their idle roguing about the country, the law ordaineth this manner of correction, the rogue being apprehended, committed to prison, and tried in the next assizes, whether they be of jail delivery or sessions of the peace. If he happen to be convicted for a vagabond either by inquest of office, or the testimony of 2 honest and credible witnesses upon their oaths, he is then immediately adjudged to be grievously whipped and burned through the gristle of the right ear, with a hot iron of the compass of an inch about, as a manifestation of his wicked life, and due punishment received for the same. And this judgment is to be executed upon him, except some honest person worth £5 in the Queen's books in goods, or 20 shillings in lands, or some rich householder to be allowed by the justices, will be bound in recognizance to retain him in his service for 1 whole year. If he be taken the second time, and prove to have forsaken his said service, he shall then be whipped again, bored likewise through the other ear, and set to service. From when if he depart before a year be expired, and happen afterwards to be attached again, he is condemned to suffer 368 pains of death as a felon, except before excepted, without benefit of clergy or sanctuary, as by the statute doth appear. Among rogues and idle persons finally, we find to be comprised all proctors that go up and down with counterfeit licenses, cousiners, and such as gad about the country, using unlawful games, practisers of physiognomy and palmistry, tellers of fortunes, fencers, players, minstrels, jugglers, pedlars, tinkers, pretensed scholars, shipmen, prisoners gathering for fees, and others so oft as they be taken without sufficient licence, from among which company our bearwards are not accepted in just cause, for I have read that they have either voluntarily, or for want of power to master their savage beasts, been occasion of the death and devoration of many children in sundry countries by which they have passed, whose parents never knew what was become of them. Holinshed vol. I. The great increase of rogues and vagabonds of all kinds led in the year 1561 to a proposition for a house of correction, the plan or scheme of which was drawn out at full length, is published in Archaeologia vol. Roman 21, p. 451. The house was to be strong and in 2 divisions, one for the men and the other for the women. It was to be built and furnished by the alms of the people where it was put up. In this case Westminster was proposed. In furnishing, care must be taken that everything should be simple, because it is to be considered beforehand that ye shall have to do with the most desperatest people of the earth, jeven to all spoil and robbery and sark as will break from you and steal. For work it must be of a kind that they cannot steal or destroy, a mill therefore for the men or a lime kiln, and for the women a wheel for cotton wool or woolen yarn. Of officers there must be 6 masters, a clerk, a porter and keeper, 2 beadles and a miller. The rations for the inmates were to be as follows: to every 4 women at every meal, 1 pound of beef, potage, bread and drink; to every 2 men working in the mill double this allowance. The allowance of bread was to be 16 ounces a day. The allowance of beer was to every 4 women 1 pottle of single beer a day, but to the men double that quantity. On fast days an equivalent of butter, cheese, herrings, pescodes, and such like. There were to be 2 pairs of stocks and shackles for the refractory. The matron was to be a strong woman. The Elizabethan female of the baser kind did not weaken her muscles and her nerves with tea. And which is very significant, it is added, "Ye must be careful of fire, for the people are desperate and care not what mischief they do." I do not know whether this proposed house of correction was erected or not. The present seems the best place and time to speak of systematic attempts at poor relief. The relief of the poor was a duty enjoined on all men. Almsgiving was 369, considered especially a virtue becoming to kings and princes. Alfred gave alms continually. The monastic houses never turned away a beggar without a meal to speed him on his way. Rich and noble persons kept open house at Christmas, Easter, and Whitsuntide. Already the custom was commenced of leaving lands or money to the church, or to the monastery, saddled with the condition of alms, to be bestowed on the anniversary of the donor. By the laws of Ethelred, which probably only confirmed a custom, the third part of the tithe due to the church was to be set aside for the use of the poor. In the canons of Elfric, the same proportion is enjoined to be so reserved, and in all the monastic houses, a certain part of the revenues was expended on the almonry or the infirmary. The custom of giving indiscriminately to any vagrant who demanded alms created a class of masterless men who would do no work and wandered about the country. It took some centuries of this growing evil before men could be brought to connect vagrancy with indiscriminate almsgiving. At first, the efforts made to repress vagrancy were directed towards compulsory work. No one dared to maintain, perhaps no one dared to think, that it was wrong to give alms to a beggar merely because he was a beggar. But everyone understood that the labourer must somehow be made to work. Had the clergy and the monastic houses perceived the truth, vagrancy might have been reduced to a few companies of outlaws and marauders. But we cannot blame the clergy of the 13th century for failing to understand what the clergy of the present century are still unable to understand. When the law interfered, the situation was well-nigh desperate. The Black Death of 1348-50 had made labour scarce and wages high. The necessity of suppressing able-bodied begging and of sending the able-bodied beggar back to his native place, and his proper work was forced upon the government. The labour statutes endeavoured to force men to work and to keep down wages. In the 14th century, just as today, there was a natural limit imposed upon wages by the price of grain and food. The rustic who understood nothing about this limit naturally desired higher and still higher wages. If he could not get this increase in his own parish, he went elsewhere. He begged his way. He found food at the monastery. He tasted the joys of food which was got without any work for it. He therefore easily dropped into the condition of the masterless man and the able-bodied beggar. In 1349 the law stepped in. No one must give alms, money, or food to the able-bodied, so that for lack of bread they might be compelled to work. The rustics, in order to escape the terrors of this law, ran about the country from place to place. They pretended to be lame, blind, dumb, paralyzed. In this disguise they wandered about begging with impunity unless they were detected. They pretended, case of impostor, wryly to go on pilgrimage. They joined companies of pilgrims begging by the way, and so got along for a time without 370 working. Therefore in 1388 other laws were framed. Nobody was allowed to beg at all without a letter granting him a license. Nobody was allowed to go on pilgrimage without a license. Nobody was to go anywhere outside his own part of the country without a license. If any were found without such warrant or permission, they were clapped into the stocks. The Act endeavoured to put a stop not only to able-bodied vagrancy, but also to beggars who were crippled or afflicted, for they, too, were forbidden to roam. The citizens of London were especially severe on masterless men. The law, at the same time, recognised the duty of relieving the impotent and the deserving poor, and the right of these to demand relief. Wherever they were found, they were compelled to go back to the place to which they belonged by birth. Nothing could be better or more effectual than these laws if they could have been enforced. But how were they to be enforced? Where were the police who might patrol the roads? How were the villagers disposed towards laws which made them accept whatever wages the lord of the manor chose to give them? In the city of London, what were the opinions of the working class, of the craftsmen? And how could the alderman in his ward ascertain that every man was following his own craft? No doubt the power of arresting, punishing, and sending to their own villages the wandering rustic had the effect of keeping down the number of the beggars. In a short time, too, the natural increase of the population relieved the scarcity of labour. Moreover, the relief of the poor by each parish was ordered by the setting aside of a portion of the tithe for their benefit, a revival of the Saxon law. And in those cases where the tithes went to a monastic house, the same portion should be payable by the monks or nuns. The jealousy with which the religious orders were already regarded is shown by the enactment of this provision by Richard Roman II, and its confirmation by Henry Roman IV. If the laws against grants of the 14th century had been enforced, there would have been an end of the evil. Unfortunately, they could not be enforced. In the country there was no kind of police. In London, the city had outgrown the old government by aldermen and ward, and the people were overflowing the city boundaries and were beyond the jurisdiction of the mayor. Now the control of the county would not be very effective, say, at Wapping or at Bermondsey, when the people began to settle there. During the whole of the 15th century, the demand for able-bodied men for the war in France first, and the civil wars next, was so great that there seemed to have been few vagrants in the country. Indications, however, are by no means wanting of a masterless element in London. The cessation of the wars threw a large number of men out of employment. 371 worse than this, it found them unwilling or unable to settle down again to steady work. Other causes also operated to produce the same result. The English nobles had ceased to maintain their large retinues. No longer did an Earl of Warwick ride into London with 700 gentlemen and men-at-arms. Sir Thomas More says expressly that the men who formerly had been in this kind of service either starved or became thieves. Again, the changes in the industrial condition of the country threw many people out of work. Lands formerly arable were turned into pasture, sheep runs took the place of cornfields, one shepherd was wanted instead of half a dozen labourers. There was again a great rise in prices, owing to the influx of silver. In 50 years, provisions of all kinds were doubled in price, while wages rose only 30%. Add to these causes the continuance of indiscriminate almsgiving. The evil grew continually during the whole of the 16th century. Early in the 16th century, the City of London began to pass regulations against vagrants. They forbade able-bodied vagrants to beg and citizens to give money to unlicensed beggars. In other words, they revived and enforced the old laws. Great strictness was ordered. Vagrants had the letter V fastened on their breasts, and were driven through Cheapside to the music of a basin ringing before them. 4 surveyors were appointed to carry out these instructions. There was also an officer appointed, called Master and Chief Avoder and Keeper out of this city, and the liberties of the same all the mighty vagabonds and beggars and all other suspected persons, except such as wear upon them the badge of the city. The vagrants, when apprehended, were whipped at the cart's tail. They also had to wear collars of iron about their necks. Those who were allowed to beg had tokens of tin given to them by the aldermen. As for the relief of the deserving poor, there were the company's stores, granaries of wheat provided for emergencies. Alms were asked for every Sunday at the church doors. The old hospitals were suppressed at the Reformation until St. Bartholomew's and St. Mary of Bethlehem were granted to the city by Henry VIII and reopened as hospitals. The city did not show to advantage in giving money to the poor. We must remember that for many centuries charity had been understood as indiscriminate alms given by the church and by rich men. What private persons gave was for the advantage of their souls. Latimer and Lever thundered in vain. Latimer says, "Now what shall we say of these rich citizens of London? What shall I say of them? Shall I call them proud men of London, malicious men of London, merciless men of London? No, I may not say so, they will be offended with me then. Yet must I speak. For is there not reigning in London as much pride, as much covetousness, as much cruelty, as much oppression, and as much superstition as was in Nebo? Yes, I think, and much more too. But London was never so ill as it is now. In times past men were full of pity and compassion, but now there is no pity. For in London their brother shall die in the streets for cold, he shall lie sick at the door between stark and stark. And 372 perish there for hunger. Was there ever more unmercifulness in Nebo? I think not. In times past, when any rich man died in London, they were wont to help the poor scholars of the universities with exhibitions. When any man died, they would bequeath great sums of money towards the relief of the poor. When I was a scholar in Cambridge myself, I heard very good report of London, and knew many that had relief of the rich men of London. But now I can hear no such good report, and yet I inquire of it and hearken for it. But now charity is waxen cold, none helpeth the scholar, nor yet the poor." Lever said, "No speakage in the behalf of these vile beggars. I will tell thee that art a noble man, a worshipful man, an honest wealthy man, especially if thou be mayor, sheriff, alderman, bailey, constable, or any such officer. It is to thy great shame afore the worlder, and to thy utter damnation afore God, to see these begging as they used to do in the streets. For there is never a one of these but he lacketh either thy charitable alms to relieve his need, or else thy due correction to punish his fault. These silly souls have been neglected throughout all England, and especially in London and Westminster. But now I trust that a good overseer, a godly bishop I mean, will see that they in these two cities shall have their need relieved, and their faults corrected, to the good ensample of all other towns and cities. Then St. Thomas's Hospital and Bridewell were obtained from the king. The latter was designed as a house of instruction and correction. It was to receive the child unapt for learning, the sore and sick when they be cured, and persons who have lost their character and either cannot work or cannot find any who will employ them. The children were to be made to work, the others were to be taught certain trades. They were to be such as would not interfere with the crafts carried on in the city. The treatment of the poor began by being the work of the towns, each town working out its own experimental methods. This was followed by legislation in Parliament. The Act of 1573, of which we have read Harrison's account, enjoined boring through the ear and whipping, and at the third offence death. The Middlesex Sessions rolls show that these sentences were actually carried out. Between 6 October and 14 December 1591, 71 vagrants were sentenced at the sessions to be branded and whipped. Who were vagrants? They were defined as proctors or procurators, persons pretending to knowledge in physnomy, palmistry and other abused sciences, masterless men, fencers, bearwards, players, minstrels, not belonging to some noble lord, jugglers, peddlers, tinkers, chapmen, labourers, refusing customary wages, counterfeiters of passes, scholars of Oxford and Cambridge who beg without licence, sailors not licensed, discharged prisoners without licence, impotent poor. But of these, players, bearwards and peddlers were allowed to carry on their calling subject to licence. In every parish, the justices of the peace were to make a register of the names of the poor. Every month they were to search for strange poor. Justices in the country and mayors in London were to assess and tax the people 373 for the relief of the poor, and those who refused to pay were to be imprisoned. 3 years later it was ordered that stock of wool, flax, hemp, iron or other stuff should be provided for the work of the poor. Between 1575 and 1597, other statutes were passed for the prevention of increased settlement of poor families. No more houses to be built within 3 miles of London westward, except for people assessed at £5 in goods or £3 in land. No tenement houses to be built, and no inmates to be received. In 1597 there was great discussion in the House of Commons on the whole subject of poor relief. Finally an act was passed by which the relief of the poor was placed in the hands of churchwardens and 4 overseers of poor elected every Easter. They had to teach children and bind them apprentice. They provided work for the adult. They relieved the impotent. They built hospitals. They levied rates. They made houses of correction. They resorted to more whipping and to banishment with death for return. Next there is the interference of the Privy Council, ordering the justices of the peace to look after the vagrants and to report. Here is a brief summary. Mayor has received a second letter from the Privy Council on subject of vagrants. Common Council considered the work of the poor at Bridewell and referred to Lords of the Council. Privy Council recommenced prevention of Irish beggars. City meets Justices of Middlesex on subject. London 1572. Mayor issued precept to aldermen to inquire about poor of every parish. Another precept to use the churchwardens, thus to assess the whole ward, to make them pay who had given nothing, and to make them pay more who had given too little. In 1573, assessments proving too little, collections were made in churches. Each parish was to elect a surveyor who every night for a week should help the constable, beadle and churchwardens in visiting the houses and sending away vagrants. Then followed a double method, relief and repression undertaken by the parish and municipal authorities together. The vagrants were taken to Bridewell, where the sick were picked out and sent to St. Thomas's and St. Bartholomew's, thence returned to Bridewell and made to work for their diet. The parish looked after the rest of the poor. The children were sent to Christ's Hospital. The impotent were relieved. It seems as if so strict a system must have been successful, but it was not. In 1601, the Act of 1579 was reconsidered and slightly altered. An act for building 1 or more houses of correction in every county was brought in. The supply of corn for the markets occupied Parliament a great deal between 1610 and 1630. There were bad harvests and general distress. The Privy Council tried to prevent scarcity, to find work for the poor, and to regulate trade in the interests of the working classes. Against times of scarcity of fuel, a coalyard was established in London for the poor. Watchmen were provided in time of plague. More almshouses existed then than now for the old and impotent. It is customary to speak of the time immediately following the Reformation as especially hard-hearted and uncharitable. For instance, here is a certain passage one of many in Stubbs's Anatomy, which is certainly strong evidence of a lack of charity. It is as follows. There is a certain city in Aelgna, Anglia, called Munidnal Londonum, whereas the poor lie in the streets upon pallets of straw, and well if they have that too, or else in the mire and dirt, as commonly it is seen, having neither house to put in their heads, covering to keep them from the cold, nor yet to hide their shame withal, nor a penny to buy them sustenance, nor anything else, but are suffered to die in the streets like dogs or beasts, without any mercy or compassion showed to them at all. And if any be sick of the plague, as they call it, or any other mortal disease, their maisters and mistresses are so impudent, having made, it should seem, a league with Satan, a covenant with hell, and an obligation with the devil, never to have to do with the works of mercy, as straightway they throw them out of their doors, and so being carried forth, either in carts or otherwise, or laid down either in the streets, or else conveyed to some oldie house in the fields or gardens, where for want of due sustentation, they end their lives most miserably. Truly, brother, if I had not seen it, I would scarcely have thought that the like Turkish cruelty had been used in all the world. 14. I would again call attention, however, to a point which has already been mentioned in these pages. Before the suppression of the religious houses, these places had taken over and held in their own hands the whole management of the poor, the sick, and the disabled, save those whom the city companies took under their own care. For centuries, therefore, the people had been taught to regard the care of the sick and old, and in a great manner the feeding of the poor, as belonging especially to the religious. It is part of the medieval mind that the poor do so belong to the monastic orders, and not to the laity. When therefore the houses were suppressed, the modern spirit of charity had to be actually created in the hearts of the people. It was then that the education in philanthropy began, which has been going on ever since. This outburst of Stubbs is a first lesson in brotherly love. Another part of the same lesson is his tirade against hard-hearted creditors, which is quoted here, because it applies especially to the citizens of London, tender and compassionate in some respects, but flinty-hearted as regards the poor prisoners who cannot pay their debts. Believe me, it grieveth me to hear, walking in the streets, the pitiful cries and miserable complaints of poor prisoners in durance for debt, and like so to continue all their life, destitute of liberty, meat, drink, though of the meanest sort, and clothing too, their backs lying in filthy straw and loathsome dung, worse than any dog, void of all charitable consolation and brotherly comfort in this world, wishing and thirsting after death to set them at liberty, and loose them from their shackles, gyves, and iron bands. Notwithstanding these merciless tigers, the usurers are grown to such barbarous cruelty that they blush not to say, Tush, he shall either pay me the whole, or else lie there till his heels rot from his buttocks. And before I will release him, I will make dice of his bones. But take heed, thou devil, for I dare not call thee Christian, lest the Lord say to thee, as he said to that wicked servant, who, having great sums forgiven him, would not forgive his brother his small debt, but catching him by the throat, said, Pay that thou owest, bind him hands and feet, and cast him into utter darkness, where shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The charities of London consisted of hospitals for the sick, almshouses, schools, and doles for the poor. It was customary for great men, ecclesiastics, and religious houses to give every day large quantities of food to the poor, whereby they were encouraged to remain poor. Stowe records many instances of this mischievous and promiscuous charity. Henry II, for instance, to show his repentance for the death of the Archbishop, fed every day 10,000 persons from the 1st of April till the harvest, a time of year when food is dearest and scarcest. Let me follow Stowe's list of foundations in chronological order. In very ancient times, the Hospital of St. James for leprous women. In 1197 Domus Day, or St. Mary Spittal outside Billingsgate. In 1247, the Hospital of St. Mary Bethlehem turned afterwards into a lunatic asylum. 1322, Elsing Spittal for 100 poor men. 1337, the College of St. Lawrence Poultney. 1358, the almshouses of Stody's Lane. 1367, John Lofkin's Hospital at Kingston-on-Thames. 1384, John Philpot's almshouses for 13 poor people. 1400, Thomas Knowles bequeathed his house as an almshouse. Whittington's College, 1421, an almshouse for 13 poor men. John Carpenter, almshouse for 4 poor men. Robert Chichely money for a dinner to 2,400 poor men, and 2d each on his Mine Day. Philip Malpass, numerous benefactions to prisoners, poor folk, girls' marriage portions, etc. Richard Rawson, girls' marriage portions. Henry Keble, girls' marriage portions and 7 almshouses. John Carlett, St. Paul's School, 353 poor men's children. John Tate enlarged and increased St. Anthony's House and almshouses. George Monarch's, almshouses for 13 poor people at Walthamstow. John Milburn, almshouses for 14 poor people. John Allen left rents for the use of the poor. Andrew Judd, almshouses. Richard Hills, the Merchant Taylors' School. Sir Thomas Gresham, almshouses. Sir Thomas Roe, almshouses. Ambrose Nicholas, almshouses. John Fuller, almshouses. Dame Agnes Foster, enlargement of Ludgate Hill Prison. Avis Gibson, almshouses. Margaret Dan, money to be lent to young men beginning as ironmongers. Dame Mary Ramsay, endowment of Christ's Hospital. The following are later endowments. Thus Sir Thomas White, citizen and merchant tailor mayor, purchased Gloucester Hall at Oxford. He founded St. John's College there. He erected schools at Bristol and Reading. To Bristol he gave £2,000 for the purchase of lands. This would produce £120 a year, which was to be administered by the mayor of Bristol. He gave £800 to be lent to 16 poor clothiers at £50 apiece as security for 10 years, and after that the money to pass to other towns, i.e. 1579 Reading, 1580 the Merchant Taylors' Company, 1581 Gloucester, 1582 Worcester, 1583 Exeter, 1584 Salisbury, 1585 Westchester, 1586 Norwich, 1587 Southampton, 1588 Lincoln, 1589 Winchester, 1590 Oxford, 1591 Hereford, 1592 Cambridge, 1593 Shrewsbury, 1594 Lynn, 1595 Bath, 1596 Derby, 1597 Ipswich, 1598 Colchester, 1599 Newcastle. He gave to the city of Coventry £1,400 with which to purchase lands to the annual value of £70, £12 poor men to have 40s, each free alms, then 4 young men were to have loans of £10 for 9 years. He did the same thing for Northampton, for Leicester, and for Warwick. A worthy benefactor indeed. In 1560 Richard Hills gave £500 towards the purchase of a house called the 377 Manor of the Rose, where the merchant tailors founded their school. At the same time, William Lambert, draper, Justice of the Peace in Kent, founded an almshouse for the poor in East Greenwich called Queen Elizabeth's Almshouses. In 1568, Sir Thomas Roe gave the city a new burial ground by Bethlehem Hospital. He also endowed a sermon every Whit Monday, gave £100 to be lent to 8 poor men, and founded an endowment for the support of 10 poor men, giving them £4 a year. William Lamb was a benefactor to the city in the 16th century. He was a cloth worker by trade. In the year 1543, on the suppression of the religious houses, he obtained possession by purchase of the smallest of them all, the chapel or hermitage standing at the corner of the wall at the end of Monkwell Street. It was called St. James's in the Wall and was endowed by Henry III. Lamb repaired or rebuilt the chapel, and placed in the former garden or in the ancient buildings certain almshouses for bedesmen. In 1577 he died, leaving this foundation and other sums of money to the clothworkers. The Great Fire spared a part of Lamb's chapel and almshouses. Lamb also drew together several springs of water near the present Foundling Hospital to a head, called after him Lamb's Conduit, though the name is now spelt without the E. He then conveyed the water by leaden pipes to Snow Hill, where he rebuilt a ruinous conduit and laid in the water. He also founded a free grammar school at Sutton Valence, the place of his nativity in Kent, with a master at £20 and an usher at £10 per ann, and an almshouse for 6 poor people, endowed with £10 yearly. He gave £10 per ann to the free school at Maidstone in Kent, for the education of needy men's children, £300 to the poor clothiers in Suffolk, Bridgnorth and Ludlow in Shropshire. He left to the Clothworkers' Company his dwelling house, a little to the southwest of Cripplegate, with lands and tenements to the value of £30 per ann. For paying a minister to read divine service on Sundays, Wednesdays and Fridays, every week, in the chapel adjoining to his house called St. James in the Wall by Cripplegate, and for clothing 12 men with a frieze gown, 1 lacram shirt, and a good strong pair of winter shoes, and 12 women with a frieze gown, a lacram smock, and a good pair of winter shoes, all ready made for wearing, to be given to such as are poor and honest, on the 1st of October. He also gave £15 towards the bells and chimes of St. Giles's without Cripplegate, 6/13, 4 yearly to the Company of Stationers, for the relief of 12 poor people of the parish of St. Faith under Paul's at the rate of 12d. in money and 12d. in bread to each of them on every Friday through the year, £6 per ann, and £100 to purchase land for the relief of children in Christ's Hospital, 4 to 378 St. Thomas's Hospital in Southwark, besides some other charities to the prisons and for portioning poor maids. Maitland, Vol. IP 264. It will be seen that the building of almshouses was the favourite method of charitable endowment. Schools were occasionally endowed, but not so commonly as almshouses. The sight of an old man broken down, unable to earn his bread, is one which appeals to the most hard-hearted. The necessity of educating the young was less understood, for the simple reason that the children of the working class were regarded as simply growing machines for labour, just as their fathers were regarded as machines in active working order whose opinions or wishes were never so much as asked, while any effort on their part to express an opinion was put down at once. This view of the working classes, which lasted till the middle of the 19th century, explains a great deal of what we now consider apathy on the part of those who should have known better. It explains among other things the opposition to reform, and the jealousy and dread of the working class, and it explains why so few schools were endowed in comparison with the number of almshouses. Chapter 9. Crime and Punishment. The divers kinds of punishment and the laws are set forth by Harrison, Holinshed Vol. I. The greatest and most grievous punishment used in England, for such as offend against the state, is drawing from the prison to the place of execution upon an hurdle or sled, where they are hanged till they be half dead, and then taken down and quartered alive. After that their members and bowels are cut from their bodies, and thrown into a fire provided near hand, and within their one sight even for the same purpose. Sometimes, if the trespass be not the more heinous, they are suffered to hang till they be quite dead. And whensoever any of the nobility are convicted of high treason by their peers, that is to say, equals, for an inquest of yeomen passeth not upon them, but only of the lords of the Parliament, this manner of their death is converted into the loss of their heads only, notwithstanding that the sentence do run after the former order. In trial of cases concerning treason, felony, or any other grievous crime not confessed, the party accused doth yield, if he be a nobleman, to be tried by an inquest, as I have said, and his peers; if a gentleman, by gentlemen, and an inferior by God and by the country, to wit the yeomanry, so combat or battle is not greatly in use, and being condemned of felony, manslaughter, etc., he is eftsoons hanged by the neck till he be dead, and then cut down and buried. But if he is convicted of wilful murder, doon either upon pretended malice, or in any notable robbery, he is either hanged alive in chains near the place where the fact was committed, or else upon compassion taken first strangled with a rope, and so continueth till his bonds consume to nothing. We have used neither of the wheel nor of the bar, as in other countries, but when wilful manslaughter is perpetrated beside hanging, the offender hath his right hand commonly striken off before or near unto the place where the act was doon, after which he is led forth to the place of execution, and there put to death according to the law. See Appendix X. Felony was involved in various kinds of crime, such as breach of prison, disfiguring the person, robbery in disguise, rape, conspiracy against the prince, 380 embezzlement of the master's money, carrying horses into Scotland, stealing hawks' eggs, unnatural offences, witchcraft, conjuring, sorcery and digging up of crosses, prophesying upon arms, cognizances, names and badges, casting of slanderous bills, poisoning, desertion, clipping of coin, taking goods from dead men, highway robbery, stealing of deer, forging documents, etc. These were all with some others felony. If a woman poison her husband, she is burned alive. If the servant kill his master, he is to be executed for petty treason. He that poisoneth a man is to be boiled to death either in water or lead, although the party die not of the practice. In cases of murder, all the accessories are to suffer pains of death accordingly. Perjury is punished by the pillory burning in the forehead with the letter P, the rewalting 15 of the trees growing upon the grounds of the offenders, and loss of all his movables. Many trespasses also are punished by the cutting of one or both ears from the head of the offender, as the utterance of seditious words against the magistrates, grain makers, petty robbers, etc. Rogues are burned through the ears. Carriers of sheep out of the land by the loss of their hands, such as kill by poison, are either boiled or scalded to death in lead or seething water. Heretics are burned quick. Harlots and their mates by carting, ducking, and doing of open penance in sheets. In churches and market steeds are often put to rebuke. Rogues and vagabonds are often starked and whipped. Scolds are ducked upon cucking stools in the water. Such felons as stand mute and speak not at their arraignment are pressed to death by huge weights laid upon a board, that lieth over their breast, and a sharp stone under their backs, and these commonly hold their peace, thereby to save their goods unto their wives and children, which if they were condemned should be confiscated to the prince. Thieves that are saved by their books and clergy, for the first offence, if they have stolen nothing else but oxen, sheep, money, or such like, which be no open robberies, as by the high way aside or assailing of any man's house in the night, without putting him in fear of his life or breaking up of his walls or doors, are burned in the left hand, upon the brawn of the thumb with an hot iron, so that if they be apprehended again, that mark bewrayeth them to have been arraigned of felony before, whereby they are sure at that time to have no mercy. I do not read that this custom of saving by the book is used anywhere else than in England, neither do I find, after much diligent enquiry, what Saxon prince ordained that law. Our third anniers of the Commonwealth are rogues, which do vary great mischief in all places where they do become. For whereas the rich only suffer injury by the first two, these spare neither rich nor poor. But whether it be great game or small, all is fish that cometh to net with them, and yet I say that both they and the rest are trussed up apace. For there is not 1 year commonly, wherein 300 or 400 of them are not devoured 381, and eaten up by the gallows in one place and other. It appeareth by Cardin, who writeth it upon the report of the Bishop of Lexuia, in the geniture of King Edward VI, how Henry VIII, executing his laws vary severally against such idle persons, I mean great thieves, petty thieves and rogues, did hang up 70,012 of them in his time. He seemed for a while greatly to have terrified the rest, but since his death the number of them is so increased, yea, although we have had no wars, which are a great occasion of their breed, for it is the custom of the more idle sort, having but once served or seen the other side of the sea under colour of service to shake hand with labour, for ever, thinking it a disgrace for himself to return unto his former trade, that except some better order be taken, or the laws be better made to be executed, such as dwell in uplandish towns and little villages shall live, but in small safety and rest. For the better apprehension also of thieves and mankillers, there is an old law in England very well provided, whereby it is ordered, that if he that is robbed, or any man complain and give warning of slaughter or murder committed, the constable of the village whereunto he cometh and crieth for succour, is to raise the parish about him, and to search woods, groves, and all suspected houses and places, where the trespasser may be, or is supposed to lurk, and not finding him there, he is to give warning unto the next constable, and so one constable after search made to advertise another from parish to parish, till they come to the same where the offender is harboured and found. It is also provided, that if any parish in this business do not his duty, 382 but suffereth the thief, for the avoiding of trouble's sake, in carrying him to the gaol, if he should be apprehended or other letting of their work to escape the same parish, is not only to make fine to the king, but also the same with the whole 100 wherein it standeth, to repair the party robbed his damages, and leave his estate harmless. Certes this is a good law, howbeit I have known by mine own experience, felons being taken to have escaped out of the stocks, being rescued by other for want of watch and ward, that thieves have been let pass, because the covetous and greedy parish owners would neither take the pains, nor be at the charge to carry them to prison if it were far off, that when hue and cry have been made even to the faces of some constables they have said, God restore your loss, I have other business at this time, and by such means the meaning of many a good law is left unexecuted, malefactors emboldened, and many a poor man turned out of that which he hath sweat and taken great pains for, toward the maintenance of himself and his poor children and family. Holinshed vol. I. The Pillory. From a historical print in the British Museum. Among the punishments mentioned above was that of boiling alive. One unfortunate named Rose, a cook in the house of the Bishop of Rochester, poisoned 18 persons, of whom 2 died. He seems to have done this wilfully. He was boiled to death. This fearful punishment was inflicted by lowering the criminal slowly, inch by inch, affixed to a post into a deep cauldron full of boiling water. How long the torture lasted before the heart stopped is not recorded. The penalty for bloodshed in the king's court was the loss of the right hand. The ceremony observed for such a punishment made a ritual of a remarkable and imposing ceremony. The offender, to quote Pike, History of Crime, Vol. Roman 2, p. 83, was brought in by the marshal, and every stage of the proceedings was under the direction of some member of the royal household. The first whose services were required was the sergeant of the woodyard, who brought in a block and cords, and bound the condemned hand in a convenient position. The master cook was there with a dressing knife, which he handed to the sergeant of the larder, who adjusted it and held it till the execution was done. The sergeant of the poultry was close by with a cock, which was to have its head cut off on the block by the knife used for the amputation of the hand, and the body of which was afterwards to be used to wrap about the stump. The yeoman of the scullery stood near, watching a fire of coals, and the sergeant farrier at his elbow to deliver the searing irons to the surgeon. The chief surgeon seared the stump, and the groom of the salcery held vinegar and cold water, to be used perhaps if the patient should faint. The sergeant of the Uri and the yeoman of the chandry attended with basin, cloths and towels for the surgeon's use. After the hand had been struck off and the stump seared, the sergeant of the pantry offered bread, and the sergeant of the cellar offered a pot of red wine, of which the sufferer was to partake with what appetite he might. On the off-hip of the croupiere, execution of a saint. On the near side of the croupiere, martyrdom of a saint. On the off side of the croupiere, the story of Saint Agatha. On the off side of the croupiere, further punishment of Saint Agatha. On the near side of the croupiere, torture of Saint George. On the near hip of the croupiere, beheading of a female saint. From the engravings upon Henry VIII's armour in the Tower of London, pickpockets, still called cut-purses, abounded. They formed a distinct profession. There was even a school for them. This educational establishment was carried on by a certain man named Wotton, at a house near Billingsgate, in the year 1585. Purses were worn at the girdle, attached by a chain or by a leathern string, and the pickpocket could be known by the horn thimble worn on the right thumb to protect it from the knife with which he cut the purse. Maitland says, p. 269. Amongst our travels this one matter tumbled out by the way, that one Wotton, a gentleman born, kept an alehouse at Smart's Quay near Billingsgate, and reared up a new trade of liff, and in the same house he procured all the cut-purses about this city to repair to his said house. There was a school-house set up to learn young boys to cut purses. There were hung up two devices, the one was a pocket, the other was a purse. The pocket had in it certain counters, and was hung about with hawk's bells, and over the top did hang a little sacringe bell. The purse had silver in it, and he that could take out a counter without any noise was allowed to be a public foister, and he that could take a piece of silver out of the purse without the noise of any of the bells, he was adjudged a judicial nipper. Note that a foister is a pickpocket, and a nipper is termed a pick-a-purse or a cut-purse. Among the many additions to literature made during the Elizabethan age, we have as detailed a description of the rogues, vagabonds, and the criminal class in London as we can desire. Their tricks and cheats, their way of living, their language or slang, can all be read in books of the time. Harrison, already quoted, furnishes a great deal. More may be read in Audley, Harman and Rowland's Decker, etc. to spare the curious reader a great deal of trouble. He is referred to Furnival's rogues and vagabonds of Shakspeare's youth. Harman's account of these cheats and rogues is full of entertaining anecdotes. For instance, there is the story of the robbery of his cauldron by the Uprit men, and how he recovered it. I lately had standing in my well house, which standeth on the backside of my house, a great cauldron of copper, being then full of water, having in the same half a dozen of pewter dishes, well marked and stamped with the cognizance of my arms, which being well noted when they were taken out, were set aside, the water poured out, and my cauldron taken away, being of such bigness that one man, unless he were of great strength, was not able far to carry the same. Notwithstanding, the same was one night within this 2 years conveyed more than half a mile from my house into a common or heath, and there bestowed in a great fir bush. I then immediately the next day sent one of my men to London, and they gave warning in Southwark, Kent Street, and Barmesey Street, to all the tinkars there dwelling, that if any such cauldron came thither to be sold, the bringer thereof should be stayed, and promised 20 shillings for a reward. I gave also intelligence to the watermen that kept the fairs, that no such vessel should be either conveyed to London or into Essex, promising the like reward, to have understanding thereof. This my doing was well understand in many places about, and that the fear of espiage so troubled the conscience of the stealer, that my cauldron lay untouched in the thick fir bush more than half a year after, which, by a great chance, was found by hunters for canize. For one chanced to run into the same bush where my cauldron was, and being perceived, one thrust his staff into the same bush, 385, and hit my cauldron a great blow, the sound whereof did cause the man to think and hope that there was some great treasure hidden, whereby he thought to be the better while he lived. And in farther searching he found my cauldron, so had I the same again unlooked for. The hooker or angler was one who by day walked about the streets, observing the windows and what was kept in them. At night he carried a stick fitted with a hook. He opened the window from the outside, and by means of his hook got out what he wanted. Once, says Harman, the hookers dragged from a bed, in which lay asleep a man and 2 boys, the blankets and upper sheets, leaving them in their shirts. Bill in Jesgate, drawn in a MS by Hugh Alley, citizen and plumber 1598, in which he inveighs against engropers and egrators, but without any argument to support his opinion. The rogue professed a part and dressed up to it. Harman tells a story of 2 rogues who wanted to break into a house but could not, because it was of stone, with the mullions of the windows too close for them to creep in. They had, however, a horselock. They woke up the tenant, who had with him only an old woman, and begged for alms. He opened the window and held out his hand with a penny in it. They seized his hand. He naturally thrust out the other to succour the first. They seized that as well and clasped the 2 into the horselock, so that he was a prisoner until he gave up all the money in the house. The wild rogue is a variety distinguished by greater courage. Harman quotes one as a beggar by inheritance. His grandfather was a beggar, his father was one, and he must needs be one by good reason. The prigger of Prancers was a horse stealer. The Palliard of Clapperdogen was one of the counterfeit sick men. He knew how to raise blisters, and to create a sore place by means of spearwort or ratsbane. The former raises a blister which passes away in a night, the latter a sore place that is incurable. The freighter, in the name we seem to catch a memory of the extinct friar, carried at his girdle a black box, in which there was a licence forged to beg. The Abram man was one who feigned to have been mad, and to have been kept in Bedlam for a term of years. The freshwater mariner or whipjack was a beggar who pretended to be a sailor on his way to get a ship, or who had recently been shipwrecked, or who had been robbed by pirates, and who showed a forged writing signed, as it seemed, by men of substance and position confirming his story. The counterfeit crank was a pretended epileptic. He carried a piece of white soap, which he put into his mouth to represent the epileptic foam. Harman draws a lively picture of such a man. He begged about the temple, his face covered with blood and his rags with mud and dirt. At noon he repaired to the back of Clement's Inn, where in a lane leading to the fields he renewed the blood on his face from a bladder which he had with him, and daubed his jerkin and hose again with mud. A certain printer watched him. In the evening he took a boat across the river. The printer followed him and caused him to be taken up in St. George's Fields as a common beggar. They took him to the constable's house, where they stripped off his rags, showing him to be a healthy and comely man with no sign of any disease. In his pockets they found the sum of 13 shillings, 3 pence and a halfpenny. They gave him an old cloak of the constable's, in which he sat by the fire and drank 3 quarts of beer, after which he threw off the cloak and ran away naked. But they found out where he lived, viz., in a pretty house well stuffed with a fair joined table and a fair cupboard garnished with pewter. So they took him to Bridewell, where they painted him, first in his disguise and next in his proper attire. Then they whipped him through London and brought him back to Bridewell, where he stayed till they thought fit to let him go. The Damerar pretended to be dumb. He carried a forged licence and generally pretended to have lost his tongue. One of them was, unluckily for himself, caught by a surgeon, who proved that he had a tongue though he had neatly folded it away somewhere, and as the fellow still would not speak, the surgeon tortured him till he did. This done, they haled him before the magistrate, who administered the usual medicine. The drunken tinker's career may be dismissed, so may that of the pedlar. The jackman made false writings and forgeries. The demander for glimmer was a woman who pretended to have been burned out, and carried a begging licence. The basket women carried laces, pins, needles and girdles for sale. They bought coney skins and they stole linen from the hedges. The autumn mort and the walking mort were also pedlars, and of evil repute. The doxy was the companion and the confederate of the upright man. The dell, the kinchin mort, and the kinchin cove were boys and girls in training for the life of the vagabond. Queen Elizabeth was fond of driving into the country as well as going upon the river. One summer evening she rode out from Aldersgate, along the road now called Goswell Road, towards the village of Islington or Islington. Just outside the town she was surrounded and beset by a number of beggars, to her great annoyance, wherefore she sent her running footman, Stone, to the mayor and to the recorder complaining of this nuisance. The recorder sent out warrants that same night to the quarters complained of, and into Westminster, with the result that 74 beggars were apprehended and sent to Bridewell, where they were punished, i.e. soundly flogged. Some of them were found to be very rich and usurers. The mob under Elizabeth did not venture in assemblies on acts of violence. One or two exceptions must be made. Once an armed company, headed by gentlemen, attacked Bridewell, seeing that their object was the release of certain unrepentant women whose profession concerned the gentlemen only. It is probable that the whole of the rioters were gentlemen. On another occasion, the prentices rose against foreigners. Instances of hatred between Spanish residents and citizens of London are common in the pages of Mackin. Thus, on October 15, 1554, a Spaniard killed a servant of Sir George Gifford without Temple Bar. The cause of the quarrel is not stated. 10 days afterwards, the unfortunate foreigner was hanged at Charing Cross. On the 4th of November following, there was a great fray at Charing Cross between Spaniards and English. Not many were hurt, and those who began it were arrested, especially a blackamoor. In January, another Englishman was murdered by 3 Spaniards, 2 of whom held him while the other ran him through. In April was hanged a certain person, servant to a poulterer. He robbed a Spaniard in Westminster Abbey, and for the offence was condemned to be hanged for 3 days, and then to be buried under the gallows. He was hanged in a gown of tawny frieze, and a doublet of tawny taffeta with hose lined with sarcenet. Before being turned off he railed at the Pope and the Mass. Of street violence there was still a great deal, but not so much as formerly. The following letter speaks for itself. On Thursday last Feb. 13th 1587, as my Lord Rich was riding in the streets, there was one Wyndham that stode in a door and shot a dag at him, thinking to have slain him. But God provided so for my Rich that this Wyndham appointing his servant that morning to charge his dag with 11 bullets. The fellow, doubting he meant to do some mischief with it, charged it only with powder and paper, and no bullet. And so this else life was thereby saved, for otherwise he had been slain. Wyndham was presently taken by my Lord Rich's men, and Bange brought before the council, confessed his intent, but the cause of his quarrel I know not, but he is committed to the Tower. The same day also, as Sir John Conway was going in the streets, Mr. Lardavite Greville came suddenly upon him and stroke him on the head with a sword, and but for one of Sir John Conway's men who warded the blow, he had cut off his legs. Yet did he hurt him somewhat on both his shines. The counsellor sent he for Lardavite Greville and have committed him to the Marshalsea. Drake, Shakespeare and His Times, Vol. Roman 2. The cucking stool, trebucket or tumbrel for the ducking of a scold, was commonly found in every village. There were several kinds of it. One was a chair set at the end of a bracer which acted on a seesaw principle, one a stump put into the ground at the edge of the water. Another was a standard, fixed at the entrance of a pond. To this was attached a long pole, at the extremity of which was fastened the chair. Such an one stood almost within the memory of man at the great reservoir in the Green Park. Another kind was a sort of cart on 4 wheels, with a bracer at the end of which was the chair. All over Oxford these things are found, also at Wootton Bassett, Broadwater, Worthing, Leominster, Marlborough, Newbury, Scarborough, Warwick, Ipswich. In 1777 a woman was ducked at Whitchurch. The trial of Ben Jonson, an account of which has been recovered by Mr. John Cordy Jefferson for the Middlesex County Record Society, began with the inquest on the body of one James Feake, held in Holywell Street, St. Leonard's, Shoreditch, in the 39th year of Queen Elizabeth, and on the 10th day of December. The said James Feake was killed in a brawl by one Gabriel Spencer, who struck him with his sword in its scabbard in the right eye, so that he fell down, and after languishing for 3 days died of the wound. What was done to Gabriel Spencer does not appear. Perhaps the case was treated as one of self-defence. However, Gabriel Spencer presently met with his reward, for in the month of September following, viz., in 1598, the said Gabriel fell to quarrelling with a young man named Ben Jonson, in Shoreditch or Hoxton Fields. From words they quickly came to blows, and Gabriel was pierced by Ben Jonson's sword through the right side, so that he died immediately. Jonson was thrown into prison and was tried for manslaughter, not for murder. He pleaded guilty. He also pleaded his clergy, read his neck verse, and was released in accordance with the statute 18 Eliz. C7, after being branded in the hand with what the London people called the Tyburn tea. I have found one instance, the earliest, of a kind of transportation. Among Frobisher's company were 6 men condemned to death. Their sentence was 389 commuted into banishment. They were sent on board Frobisher's ship, to be landed on the shores of Friesland. that is Greenland or Labrador, with weapons and provisions. They were instructed to win the goodwill and friendship of the natives and to inquire into their estate. In other words, to find out all that could be learned concerning them. It is unfortunate that history makes no further mention of these pioneers. The Cucking Stool. From an old print in the British Museum. The story of Thomas Appletree, his terrible accident, his deadly peril, his repentance and his pardon is pathetic. I suffer Stowe to tell it in his own words. The 17th day of July, the Queen's most excellent Majesty, being in ye river of Tharmes, betwixt here Highness Manor of Greenwich and Detterford, in her privy barge, accompanied with Monsieur Schemier the French ambassador, the Earl of Lincolney, and Maester Vice-Chamberlain, etc., with whim she entered discourse about weighty affairs. It chanced that one Thomas Appletree, a young man and servant to Maester Henry Carey, with 2 or 3 children of Her Majesty's chapel, and one other named Barnard Acton, being in a boat on the Tharmes, rowing up and down betwixt the places above named, the foresaid Thomas Appletree had a caliver or harquebuse, which he had 3 or 4 times discharged with bullet, shooting at random very rashly, who by great misfortune shot one of the watermen, being the second man next unto the bales of the said barge, labouring with High's oar, which sate within 5 feet of Her Highness, clean through both High's arms. The blow was so great and grievous that it moved him out of his place, and forced him to cry and scritch out he piteously, supposing himself to be slain, and saying he was shot through the body, the man bleeding abundantly, as though he had had 100 daggers thrust into him. The Queen's Majesty showed such noble courage as is most wonderful to be heard and spoken of, for beholding him so maimed, and bleeding in such force, she never bashed thereat, but showed effectually a prudent and magnanimous heart, and most courteously comforting 390 the poor man, she bade him be of good cheer, and said he should want nothing that might be for his ease, commanding him to be covered till such time as he came to the shore, till which time he lay bathing in his own bloud, which might have been an occasion to have terrified the eyes of the beholders. But such and so great was the courage and magnanimity of our dread and sovereigny lady, that it never quailed. To be short, Thomas Appletree and the rest were apprehended and brought before her honourable council, who with great gravity and wisdom employed their times very carefully, and with great diligence examined the said Appletree and his companions, and finding the case most heinous and wicked, justly pronounced against him the sentence of death, and commit him to the Marshalsea in Southwark, from whence ye Tuesday following he was brought through the city with the Knight Marshal's men, led up to the Tower Hill, and so to Radcliffe up to Blackwall, and so down to the waterside, where was a gibbet set up, directly placed betwixt Deptford and Greenwich, for the execution of this malefactor, who indeed very pitifully bewailed the offence he had committed, and as well in prison as by the way prepared himself very penitently and willingly to offer his body to the death. Thus very guardly he purposed to finish his miserable and wretched life, and so prepared himself to ascend and go up the ladder, and being on the same he turned himself, and spake to the people as followeth. Good people, I am come hither to die, but God is my judge, I never in my life intended hurt to the Queen's most excellent Majesty, nor meant the harm of any creature. But I pray to God with all my heart long to prosper and keep her hinds in health, who bless and defend her from all perils and dangers, who prosper her in all her affairs, and bless her most honourable council, giving them grace to do all things to the glory of God, and the benefit of this realmy. But of all things I am most sorry for my offence, and wofully bewail the same. And more, I am penitent and sorry for my good Maester Henry Carey, who hath been so grieved for my fault, suffering rebuke. For the same, I would to God I had never been born that have so grievously offended him. And with that the tears gushed out of his eyes very fast. This said, he persuaded all men to serve God, and to take an example by him, and every night and morning moved them devoutly to say the Lord's Prayer. And as the executioner had put the rope about his neck, the people cried, "Stay, stay, stay," and with that came the Right Honourable Sir Christopher Hatton, Vice-Chamberlain to her hinds, who enquired what he had confessed, and being certified as is before expressed, he bylaid his bonnet and declared that the Queen's Majesty had sent him thither both to make the cause open to them how heinous and grievous the offence of he said Thomas Appletree was, and further to signify to him her 391 gracious pleasure, and so continued his message, as ye may read it printed by itself, and annexed to this discourse. Which when he had declared, the hangman was commanded to take the rope from his neck. Appletree being come down from the ladder, received his pardon, and gave God and the Prince praise for so great a benefit as he had by her most gracious bounty received. This done, Maester Vice-Chamberlain said, "Good people, pray for the Queen's Majesty, and then was this prayer said, which is usually read, for the preservation of Her Majesty in the Church. O Almighty and everlasting God, the Lord of lords and King of kings, which dost frow thy throne, behold all the dwellers of the earth, most heartily we beseech thee with thy favour to behold our most gracious sovereigny Lady Queen Elizabeth, etc. Whereunto all the people joyfully accorded to say Amen, crying, God save the Queen, casting up their caps. Stowe's Chronicles of England. One of the last cases of ordeal by battle belongs to the year 1571. The 18th of June, in Trinity term, there was a combat appointed to have been fought for a certain manor, and domain lands belonging thereunto in the Isle of Harty, adjoining to the Isle of Sheppey in Kent. Simon Lowe and John Kyme were plaintiffs, and had brought a writ of right against Thomas Paramore, who offered to defend his right by battle. Whereupon the plaintiffs aforesaid accepted to answer his challenge, offering likewise to defend their right to the same manor and lands, and to prove by battle that Paramore had no right nor good title to have the same manor and lands. Hereupon the said Thomas Paramore brought before the judges of the Common Pleas of Westminster one George Thorne, a big, broad, strong set fellow, and the plaintiffs Henry Naylor, Master of Defence and servant to the Right Honourable the Earl of Leicester, a proper slender man and not so tall as the other. Thorne cast down a gauntlet which Naylor took up, upon the Sunday before the battle should be tried. On the next morrow the matter was stayed, and the parties agreed that Paramore being in possession should have the land, and was bound in £500 to consider the plaintiffs, as upon hearing the matter the judges should award. The Queen's Majesty abhorring bloodshed, and as the poet very well saith, Tristia sanguinae duitans praelia campi, was the taker up of the matter in this wise. It was thought good that for Paramore's assurance the order should be kept touching the combat, and that the plaintiffs Lowe and Kyme should make default of appearance, but that yet such as were sureties for Naylor their champion's appearance should bring him in, and likewise those that were sureties for Thorne should bring in the same Thorne in discharge of their band, and that the court should sit in Tuthill Fields where 392 was prepared one plot of ground of 21 yards square, double railed for the combat. Without the West Square, a stage being set up for the judges, representing the court of the Common Pleas. All the compass without the lists was set with scaffolds one above another, for people to stand and behold. They were behind the square where the judges sat, 2 tents, the one for Naylor, the other for Thorne. Thorne was there in the morning timely. Naylor about 7 of the clock came through London, apparelled in a doublet, and galley gascoon breeches all of crimson satin, cut and rased, a hat of blacky velvet with a red feather and band, before him drums and fifes playing. The gauntlet cast down by George Thorne was borne before the said Naylor upon a sword's point, and his baston, a staff of an ell long made taper wise, tipped with horn, with his shield of hard leather was borne after him. As Ascombe, a yeoman of the Queen's Guard, he came into the place at Westminster, and staying not long before the hall door, came back into the King's Street, and so along thorough the Sanctuary and Tuthill Street into the field, where he stayed till past 9 of the clock. And then Sir Jerome Bowes brought him to his tent, Thorne being in the tent with Sir Henry Cheney long before. About 10 of the clock, the Court of Common Pleas removed, and came to the place prepared. When the Lord Chief Justice with 2 other his associates were set, then Lowe was called solemnly to come in, or else to lose his writ of right. Then after a certain time, the swearties of Henry Naylor were called to bring in the said Naylor, champion for Simon Lowe, and shortly thereupon, Sir Jerome Bowes, leading Naylor by the hand, entered with him the lists, bringing him down that square by which he entered, being on the left hand of the judges, and so about till he came to the next square, just against the judges, and there, making courtesy, first with one leg and then with the other, passed forth till he came to the middle of the place, and then made the like obeisance, and so passing till they came to the bar, there he made the like courtesy, and his shield was held up aloft over his head. Naylor put off his netherstocks, and so barefoot and barelegged, save his silk scoylones to the ankles, and his doublet sleeves tied up above the elbow, and bareheaded, came in as is aforesaid. Then were the swearties of George Thorne called to bring in the same Thorne, and immediately Sir Henry Cheney entering at the upper end on the right hand of the judges, used the like order in calming about by his side, as Naylor had before on that other side, and so coming to the bar with like obeisance, held up his shield. Proclamation was made that none should touch the bars, nor presume to come within the same, except such as were appointed. After all this solemnly order was finished, the Lord Chief Justice rehearsing 393 the manner of bringing the writ of right by Simon Lowe, of the answer made thereunto by Paramore, of the proceeding therein, and how Paramore had challenged to defend his right to the land by battle by his champion Thomas Thorne, and of the accepting the trial that was by law with his champion Henry Naylor. And then for default of appearance in law, he adjudged the land to Paramore, and dismissed the champion, acquitting the swearties of their bands. He also willed Henry Naylor to render again to George Thorne his gantlet, whereto the said Naylor answered that his lordship might command him any thing, but willingly he would not render the said gantlet to Thorne, except he could win it. And further he challenged the said Thorne to play with him 50 blows, to show some pastime to the Lord Chief Justice and to the other there assembled. But Thorne answered that he came to fight and would not play. Then the Lord Chief Justice, commending Naylor for his valiant courage, commanded them both quietly to depart the field, etc. Stowe's Chronicles of England.